Tonight we are building a Viking ship the slow way, the correct way, and the way that annoys deadlines the most. We will start in a quiet oak forest, follow the grain like it is giving instructions, and turn a stubborn tree into a hull made of overlapping planks stitched with iron. Along the way a jarl will arrive with a spring deadline, a blacksmith will provide calm sparks, and Tar will do the unglamorous work of keeping the sea politely outside. Settle in. Let the waves do the counting. Chapter 1. The sponsor arrives with a deadline. Alder Bay looked busy in the way that only a shipyard can. Tools lay on benches like they had chosen to rest there. Coils of rope waited in patient spirals. A stack of timber sat under a rough tarp, pretending it was not listening to the sea. The fog was low and damp. The gulls were loud and certain. The tide moved in and out with the calm confidence of something that did not care about deadlines. Ewan Ashford stood near the slipway with his boots in wet sand. He watched the waterline as if it might explain itself. It never did. It only kept being water, which was a steady job and therefore respectable. Bram Reed carried a bundle of thin offcuts across the yard. He held them like they were important. He set them down a little too carefully, then wiped his hands on his tunic and waited for Ewan to notice the effort. Ewan noticed everything. He simply did not reward everything. "The fog is low today," Ewan said. Bram nodded as if fog had been scheduled. "It makes the bay look mysterious." "It makes the bay look damp," Ewan said. "Mystery is what people call damp when they want it to sound useful." Bram smiled, polite and familiar. He had learned that Ewan was not cruel. Ewan was just allergic to unnecessary excitement. Footsteps crunched on the path above the cove. Bram turned first, shoulders lifting into a posture that hoped to look employed. Shapes emerged through the fog, then cloaks, then faces. Jarl Rowan of Alder Bay came down the slope with 2 guards behind him, and a scribe carrying a leather satchel and a wax tablet. Rowan wore the kind of cloak that looked heavy and expensive, which meant he had important reasons to stand where the wind could not reach him. His boots were clean, which meant he had not fought any mud on the way here. He had simply arrived, as important people tend to do. Rowan raised a hand. Ewan gave a small nod in return. Ewan did not step forward. Sponsors like builders to move first. Ewan liked sponsors to remember who had the tools. "Ewan Ashford," Rowan said. "I have heard your ships do not sink." "Some of them do," Ewan said, "but they do it slowly. Most people consider that polite." Rowan let out a short laugh like a door closing gently. "Good. I prefer my ships polite." The guards stayed a few paces back. Their eyes moved over the yard as if a plank might rise up and become dramatic. The scribe looked at everything with the anxious respect of someone who believed life could be improved by writing it down. Rowan stepped onto the sand. He looked at the slipway, the shed, the stacked timber, the quiet tools, the fog. He inhaled once and decided not to comment on the smell. It is hard to compete with tar and seaweed, and shipyards do not try. "I will not circle around it," Rowan said. "I want a ship built." Euron waited, calm. "A ship that can carry goods," Rowan continued. "Wool, barrels, iron, timber, maybe livestock if the livestock behave. A ship that can handle open water and also shallow coastal places. A ship that can be rowed when the wind is sulking and sailed when the wind remembers its job." Bram felt a warm lift in his chest. He could see it already. A clean hull rising plank by plank. A sail like a broad wing. A vessel that would make the bay look proud instead of damp. "And," Rowan added, "I want it ready for the spring gathering at Tunsberg harbour." The air changed, loudly, just enough for Bram to notice. A deadline had entered the yard, and deadlines never wiped their boots. "Spring gathering," Euron repeated, like he was tasting the words for splinters. "Yes," Rowan said. "Everyone arrives with gifts and excuses. I would like to arrive with something better than excuses." Euron looked out toward the tide. The sea did not reply. It never did. The sea let people talk until they heard themselves. "How large?" Euron asked. "And how much cargo?" Rowan made a gesture with one hand, as if size could be measured by confidence. not enormous. I do not need a floating barn. I need something that carries enough to matter and still moves quickly enough that I do not feel old while watching it. In other words, Euron said, you want the ship to flatter you. Rowan held his smile sharp at the edges. I want the ship to do its work. Ships do their work whether they flatter anyone or not, Euron said. It is the people who are delicate. Bram kept his face neutral. He did not know the exact price of laughing at a Jarl, and he suspected it was not discounted. Euron walked to a low table near the shed and picked up a piece of charcoal. He drew a single curve on a thin board, not a full plan. Just an idea shaped like a promise. If you want a ship built the way our people build them, Euron said, it will be clinker built. The scribe paused, stylus hovering. He pressed it down again, eager to catch the word. Clinker built, Euron repeated. The planks overlap like scales. Each strake lies over the one below. The overlap is fastened with iron rivets and roves. The hull becomes a shell first, then we add the frames inside. Rowan folded his arms. Why build the outside first? Would it not be simpler to build the bones first and then put the skin on? It would be simpler, Euron said. Simpler is not the same as better. Frame first planking makes a smooth hull, but clinker gives strength with less weight. The overlaps act like long ribs running along the ship. The hull can flex with the sea, instead of arguing with it. Rowan watched the curve on the board. He did not look bored. That was promising. Many sponsors only loved results. Rowan loved results, and also loved the feeling of understand them. And, Ewan added, it lets us build a ship light enough to haul up on a beach if you need to, which is useful when you want to visit places that do not have the courtesy to build proper docks. Bram could not help himself. It can be fast, too. Ewan gave him a sideways look. It can. Fast depends on the shape, the balance, the sail, and whether the crew is awake. Rowan glanced at Bram. This is your apprentice. Ewan nodded. He is learning to talk less and see more. Bram took that as encouragement, because Bram was built that way. Rowan stepped closer to the board. The keel, he asked. The spine, Ewan said. Oak if we can get good oak. Straight grain, no hidden rot, no knots where knots like to gather. The keel runs from stem to stem and the ship stays true. Symmetry matters, not because it looks pretty, although it does. It matters because the ship will handle cleanly when the wind shifts and the sea decides to be creative. Rowan tapped the table once with a finger. How long? Ewan did not answer immediately. He looked at the fog, he looked at the tide, he looked at the tools that would soon have to earn their keep. He thought, which was what deadlines feared most. From keel laying to launch, Euron said, we can do it by the spring gathering, only if the weather behaves, and the timber behaves, and the iron behaves, and you behave. Rowan lifted an eyebrow. I behave. You arrived with a deadline and a cloak, Euron said. That is not what I call behaving. That is what I call announcing. Rowan released a slow breath. It might have been laughter, it might have been restraint. What do you need? Euron set the charcoal down. Good timber first, iron for rivets and roves, wool or hair for caulking, tar to seal and protect, rope, sailcloth or the mean to weave it, hands that can work quietly when the work gets slow. Bram felt that last part like a gentle stone placed in his pocket. Heavy enough to remember, not heavy enough to hate. Rowan nodded. I can provide what you need. There is timber inland, there is iron from the forge at Westmere, there is tar from Signy Tarwell if you can tolerate her opinions. I can tolerate opinions, Euron said. They make the work entertaining. Rowan looked pleased, which was a dangerous emotion in a sponsor. Fine, then we are agreed. Euron did not nod yet. Come, he said, walk with me. A ship is not only a list, it is a shape that lives in water. Rowan hesitated, then followed. Bram followed too, because Bram followed everything, including hope. They walked along the tide line. Shell fragments clicked underfoot. The fog thinned enough to reveal the curve of Alder Bay, and the narrow mouth where the wider sea waited. The bay was sheltered, but not soft. No place by the sea was truly soft. Ewan knelt and drew in the sand with wine finger. A long line for the keel, a gentle rise for the bow and stern, a widening at midship, careful and measured. Not too wide, Ewan said. Wide ships carry more but push more water. Not too narrow. Narrow ships are quick but can feel twitchy under load. You want enough belly for barrels, and enough grace that you do not need to apologize to the sea. Rowan crouched, studying the sand drawing as if it were a map to respect. And the planks, he asked. Overlapping. Yes, Ewan said. We split wood along the grain, we cleave it. The tree has a direction it prefers. If we respect it, the plank keeps its strength. We shape with axe and adze, we fit each strake, we fasten overlaps with rivets. The shell becomes firm, and then the frames go in to support it, Bram added. Like building a basket, but the wood argues more. Ewan kept his voice calm. The wood is not arguing, it is waiting for you to stop rushing. Bram nodded, suddenly serious. Rowan pointed at the bow curve. The stem rises high. It helps with waves, Ewan said. It keeps the ship from burying its nose like an eager dog. It also looks confident. Sponsors like confidence. Rowan stared at the sand shape. My rivals will have carved heads, dragons, beasts. I should have something like that. Carving takes time, Ewan said, and time is the one thing you brought here to threaten me with. If you need a carved head to feel secure, you can add it later. Bolt it on when you are in a mood. Bram held his breath. The guards shifted. The scribe paused, stylus suspended like a small judgment. Rowan stared at Ewan for a long moment, then his mouth curved into real amusement. You are bold. I am tired, Ewan said. From far away, tired looks like bold. Rowan laughed, longer now. Fine. No carved head. I will allow the sea to remain calm without being threatened by art. They walked back toward the yard. The fog lifted a little more and the slipway rails looked darker and older, ready for the scrape of a hull that did not exist yet. Rowan stopped at the top of the slipway and looked down its length. If you build the shell first, he asked, how do you keep it from going crooked? We set the keel true, Ewan said. We set the stems. We use temporary moulds to guide the shape. We measure constantly. Not by trusting eyes, but by trusting lines. Balance, symmetry, and the stubborn refusal to accept a curve that does not belong. Bram found a small grin. Also by trusting Ewan to stare at mistakes until they repent. Ewan gave Bram a look. It was not a glare, it was a tide turning. Rowan nodded, satisfied. Skill then, skill, Ewan said, and time, and the willingness to redo work that is not right. The sea punishes pride. It does not care about expensive cloaks. Rowan glanced down at his cloak, then looked away as if the cloak had betrayed him. I will send cutters tomorrow. I will send iron and tar. I will send hands. Send hands that listen, Ewan said. I do not need people who swing an axe like they are trying to win an argument. I need people who can follow a line and stop before they ruin it. Rowan gave a short nod. Sensible people, then. Bram almost laughed. In Bram experience, sensible people were rare and usually busy elsewhere, but perhaps Giles kept them in a box. Rowan looked at Bram. Apprentice, can you help build a ship in time? Bram swallowed. His voice came out steady. Yes, I can. Rowan studied him. Then do not unalive the ship with enthusiasm. Save your enthusiasm for lifting. Bram blinked, then nodded quickly. I will not unalive anything. Ewan gave a small approving nod. That is an excellent goal for a day. Rowan turned to leave. The guards followed. The scribe lingered a heartbeat longer, eyes on the tools and the charcoal curve on the board. He looked like someone trying to understand how wood and iron became something that could cross a seared. Then he hurried after Rowan, because scribes did not enjoy being alone in fog. When they were gone, the yard felt quiet but not calm. It felt like the moment after a bell rings, when everyone pretends they did not hear it. Bram exhaled. He wants it by spring. People want many things, Ewan said. Can we do it? Ewan picked up the adze and checked the edge with his thumb, careful and respectful. We can do it if we do it properly. If we rush, the ship will remember. Wood remembers, iron remembers, the sea remembers most of all. Bram stared down the slipway. He imagined the keel laid straight, the first strakes fitted, the hull rising plank by plank, rivets clenched, seams sealed, a mast lifted into pale sky, a sail folded like a blanket waiting to be shaken out. What do we do first? Ewan looked inland toward the dark line of trees beyond the dunes. We find the right trees. We ask the forest politely to become a ship. Bram nodded, solemn, and the forest says yes. The forest does not speak, Ewan said. It only waits. We will do the speaking with axes, calmly, without drama. Bram tried to look serious. Without drama, there will be drama, Ewan said. There is always drama. A plank will fight its curve. A rivet will refuse to sit. Weather will arrive uninvited. Someone will step on something sharp. Then we will fix it quietly. That is the craft. The fog continued to lift. Sunlight spilled across the bay in pale strips. The tide kept doing its work without noticing anyone. Ewan stood a moment longer by the slipway, hand resting on the old rail. We will build a ship that carries weight and still moves, he said. A ship that takes a sail and takes an oar. A ship that can be hauled up on a beach when needed. A ship that flexes instead of snapping. Plank over plank, shell first, layer by layer, with patience. Bram listened, excitement settling into something steadier. Ewan turned toward the shed. Pack tools. Tomorrow we walk to the timber stand, bring food, bring cord, and bring the ability to keep your mouth closed when you want to fill the air with hope. Bram gave a quick smile. I can do that. Ewan raised an eyebrow. Bram sobered a little. I will try. Ewan nodded once, calm as ever. Good. Trying is the start of every ship. Then comes the next right cut. Chapter 2. The Forest That Did Not Ask for This. Morning arrived quietly, the way it does when it knows it will be ignored. The yard smelled of damp wood and old tar. The fog had thinned overnight, leaving the bay clear enough to see the ripples where the tide had moved, like a careful hand-smoothing cloth. Bram woke early and tried to be useful before anyone noticed him. He packed a satchel with bread, dried fish, and a small wedge of cheese that looked like it had survived several arguments. He added cord, because Ewan always asked for cord, and because cord was the kind of thing people forgot right up until the moment they needed it. Ewan checked the tool bundle without ceremony. Axe, adze, draw knife, wedges, mallet, auger, measuring line, a small kit for sharpening because dull tools turned work into punishment. Bram watched Ewan tie the bundle. It was neat. It was calm. It suggested that time was a friend, not a threat. They set off inland along a track that cut through low scrub and scattered pines. The air smelled of wet earth and cold leaves. Somewhere ahead, oak trees waited with the slow patience of things that had never rushed for anything. Bram tried to keep quiet. He succeeded for almost an entire minute. So, Bram said, how do you choose the right tree? Ewan kept walking. You look for trouble. Bram frowned. Trouble. A ship begins as a tree, Ewan said. Trees hide their faults. Twist in the grain, a scar from old wind, a hollow where water sat too long. You want timber that has lived a steady life, no drama, straight growth. A trunk that does not look like it has been practicing for a dance. Bram nodded, absorbing it. He glanced at the woods around them. Many trunks leaned. Some curved. Some split into forks. Bram realized that most trees had personalities, and most personalities were inconvenient in boat building. They reached a small stream. The water was shallow and quick, sliding over stones. Bram stepped on a rock that looked solid and felt slippery. His foot shot sideways. He windmilled his arms, then recovered with a gasp. The stream tried to unalive me, Bram said. The stream does not care about you, Ewan said. That is what makes it honest. They crossed and continued. As the ground rose, the trees changed. Fewer pines, more broad leaf shapes. The air grew richer, heavier with leaf litter and the quiet scent of old wood. A man waited near the edge of the oak stand. He was not tall, but he looked rooted. His hair was grey, his hands broad. He held a staff more as a habit than a need. "Hail," Ewan said, like greeting a familiar tool. "Ewan," the man replied. Then his eyes went to Bram. "New win." Bram bowed his head, uncertain how much. "Hello, this is Holden," Ewan said. "He watches this stand." If the trees could complain, he would listen. Holden grunted. "The trees do complain. People just do not hear the language." Bram looked at the oak trunks. They stood thick and solid, bark rough, branches high. These were older trees, the sort that made shade feel heavy. Holden stepped forward and walked among them. Ewan followed. Bram trailed behind, trying not to step on anything that could turn into a lecture. Holden stopped at one oak and rested a hand on the bark. "This un," he said. "Too many branches low, knots. Good for fire, bad for keel." He moved on. He stopped at another. "Lightning scar." "No." He stopped at a third. "Twist." "No." Bram watched, fascinated. It was like watching someone read a book where every page was a trunk. Holden paused at a tall oak with a straight rise and few lower branches. He looked up, then down, then walked around it slowly. He tapped the trunk with his knuckles. He turned to Ewan. "This is clean." Ewan circled the tree once, hand brushing the bark. He leaned in, eyes narrowed as if listening through wood. Bram waited. His own mind filled with images of the keel, long and straight, the backbone that would hold the ship true. He understood now why Ewan had looked tired when Rowan said spring. A ship began here, with choices that could not be hurried. "This one for the keel," Ewan said. "If Rowan truly sends cutters, we will take it. If he sends people who swing an axe like a festival, we will take over before they ruin it." Halden gave a slow nod. "I will watch them. If they act foolish, I will make a sound they understand." Bram dared a question. "What sound?" Halden looked at him. The sound of a man who is about to become disappointed. Bram nodded. He understood that sound very well. Ewan moved deeper into the stand. He pointed to another tree. "Planks," he said. "Strakes want straight grain and good thickness. We will cleave, not saw." Bram had heard the word yesterday. He still wanted it to be more magical than it was. Ewan chose a tree for planks, then another. He spoke softly as he moved, marking with charcoal, measuring with eyes trained by years. "Oak is heavy," Bram said. "Why not lighter wood?" "Because the sea is heavier," Ewan said. "Oak holds where stress lives. It takes fastenings well. It tolerates hard work. Lighter woods have their place, but for keel and main strakes, oak is honest." Holden stopped by a fallen log and kicked it lightly. "This one fell last winter, good for smaller pieces, knees and blocks." Ewan nodded. "We will take what we can." A ship uses more than people think. Not planks, blocks, cleats, wedges, fittings. If you do not plan, you spend your life hunting for a small piece of wood while the rest of the yard waits and pretends not to judge you. Bram pictured himself searching through scrap piles. He could already feel the future judgment. Rowan cutters arrived late morning, 4 men with axes, loud enough to frighten birds. They came with a cart and a pair of oxen, and the confidence of people who had never split a plank wrong in front of anyone important. Holden watched them approach with a face like stone. Bram wondered if Holden had been carved that way on purpose. The lead cutter saluted Ewan with an exaggerated gesture. "Jarl Rowan sends us. We cut, you build." Ewan nodded. "You cut carefully." "Carefully," the cutter repeated, as if the word tasted odd. Ewan pointed to the keel tree. "That un. Straight cuts. Control your fall. Do not splinter the base." The cutter gave a grin that suggested he believed falling trees should simply agree to fall well. Ewan stepped back. Holden stayed close enough to be a warning. The first axe blows landed. The sound was steady and heavy. Chips flew. Bram watched the notch form, then the back cut begin. The cutters worked fast. Too fast. Ewan shifted his weight, eyes narrowing. Bram felt the mood change. It was the same as in the yard when a plank refused to fit. Quiet tension. Quiet calculation. The tree began to lean. The lead cutter shouted something unnecessary. The trunk creaked. The fall angle was wrong. It would twist as it dropped. Ewan moved in, calm but sharp. Stop. The cutters hesitated. The tree did not. Ewan grabbed a wedge and drove it into the cut with a mallet. The wedge sank and changed the pressure. The trunk paused, complained, then leaned the right way, like a stubborn animal finally accepting a lead rope. The tree fell with a deep crash, branches shuddering, leaves shaking loose like startled birds. The trunk settled without splitting. Bram breathed again. He had not realized he had stopped. Ewan looked at the cutters. "That," he said, "is why you do not rush." The lead cutter scratched his neck, suddenly less confident. "Yes." Halden made his disappointed sound. It was not loud. It was enough. The cutters moved more carefully after that. The second tree fell clean. The third. By the fourth, their shoulders had relaxed into the slower rhythm that wood demanded. Bram helped strip branches, dragging them aside. He learned quickly how heavy green oak felt. It was not just weight, it was insistence. The wood resisted being treated like a simple object. When the trunks were limbed, Ewan marked sections. Keel length, stem pieces, plank logs. "Now," Ewan said to Bram, "you learn the part that makes sawyers sigh." "Cleaving," Bram said, eager. "Yes," Ewan said. "The tree has a grain, the grain is a path, we follow it." They rolled a plank log onto smaller supports. Ewan set the first wedge at the end grain and tapped it with the mallet. The wedge bit in. A crack formed, thin as a promise. Ewan tapped again. The crack grew, running along the log like a line drawn by a careful hand. He placed a second wedge, then a third, working down the length. The log opened slowly, splitting into halves with a sound like a long breath. Bram stared. It looked easy. He suspected it was only easy because Ewan was doing it. "Try," Ewan said, holding out the mallet. Bram took it and placed a wedge where Ewan pointed. He tapped. Nothing. He tapped harder. The wedge sank a little. The crack did not appear. Bram frowned. He tapped again, harder. The wedge bit. A crack formed, then veered sideways like it was avoiding him. Ewan placed a hand lightly on the mallet head, stopping Bram before enthusiasm could become a mistake. "Do not hit it like it owes you money," Ewan said. "Let the wedge work. Listen to the sound. Feel the resistance. The wood is not a wall. It is a map." Bram nodded. He adjusted the wedge, tapped again. The crack straightened, grudging but obedient. "Better," Ewan said. "See? You can learn without threatening the forest." Halden watched with the faint approval of a man who likes seeing a young person survive education. They cleaved more sections. Each split revealed pale fresh wood inside, smooth and damp, smelling faintly sweet. Bram ran a finger along the split face. It was cleaner than a saw cut. The fibers followed the length as if the plank had always wanted to exist. "This is why," Ewan said. "Sawing cuts fibers, cleaving respects them. A plank with continuous fibers holds strength. It bends and keeps its will. That matters when waves push and twist and try to make a ship confess its weaknesses." Bram looked at the halves, then at the growing stack of cleft pieces. "So the ship begins with listening." Ewan nodded. "Everything begins with listening. The sea, the wood, even sponsors, though that part is optional." By late afternoon the cart was loaded with the first haul. The oxen stood patient, sides heaving, eyes calm. They looked like they had known too many men who believed shouting moved weight. The cutters wiped sweat and tried to look proud. Holden gave them a look that suggested pride was fine as long as it stayed quiet. "Rowan wants speed," Bram said as they watched the cart start down the track. "Rowan wants to be seen," Ewan said. Speed is just how he talks about it. Bram thought of the spring gathering, crowded harbour, new sails, new hulls, smiles that were more sharp than kind. A ship was not just transport, it was a statement. Ewan picked up a cleft plank section and hefted it. "This will become a strake," he said. "Not yet. First it rests. Green wood works easily, but it also moves as it dries. We shape it at the right time. Not too wet, not too dry." Bram nodded. He tried to imagine waiting, but waiting felt like wasting to him. He kept that thought private. Ewan could sense impatience the way a dog senses fear. They walked back toward Alder Bay as evening approached. The light softened, birds quieted, the forest felt less like a workshop and more like a place that had simply allowed them to borrow something. At the stream, Bram stepped carefully. This time the rock did not try to teach him humility. Back at the yard, the fog returned in thin layers, sliding in like a cautious guest. The bay went still. The tide turned. The tools waited. Bram set down the remaining small pieces they had carried by hand. His arms ached in a satisfying way. He felt like he had earned tiredness instead of being given it. Ewan stood beside the stacked timber and rested a hand on the top piece. "This," he said, "is how a ship begins. But with loud plans, with good wood and quiet choices." Bram looked at the stack, then at the slipway. The rails ran down to the water, still empty, still waiting. Bram could almost see the future hull there, overlapping planks catching light, seams tight, tar dark and warm. "Tomorrow," Bram asked, "what do we do?" Ewan looked at the timber, then at the sky. "Tomorrow we do it again, more timber, more cleaving. Then we start shaping the keel. We do not skip steps. We do not bribe the sea. We build like we mean to sleep at night." Bram felt his mind settle, the way a boat settles when it finds its balance. He liked that. He wanted more of that. Ewan turned toward the shed. "Eat, rest, and try not to dream of cutting corners. Corners do not belong in ships." Bram gave a soft laugh. "I will try." Ewan nodded, satisfied. Trying is still useful, as long as the next day includes doing. Outside, Alder Bay breathed with the tide. Inside, the yard held the first pieces of a ship that had not asked to be built and would be built anyway, carefully, calmly, plank by plank, because that was what hands were for. Chapter 3. The Keel, a long piece of opinionated wood. The timber arrived at Alder Bay in a slow procession of oxen and grunting men. The cart wheels complained over the track. The oxen did not. The oxen had long ago learned that complaining rarely moved weight. Bram stood at the yard edge and watched the first keel log roll down onto skids. The oak looked darker now that it was in the shipyard. It smelled of leaf mould and cold rain, and the quiet patience of something that had been alive longer than Bram had been complicated. Ewan checked the log with the kind of attention that made people feel nervous. He ran a hand along the bark. He looked at the end grain. He tapped the wood once, not hard, like greeting an old acquaintance. "Good," he said. "Not perfect, good." Bram leaned in. "How can you tell?" Ewan looked at Bram. "Because it is not pretending. Straight grain. No hidden hollow, no twist that wants to become a problem later." Bram nodded, trying to look like he had known this all along. The cutters unloaded the rest of the timber, plank logs for future strakes, a shorter length that would become a stem piece, smaller bits for blocks and knees, a bundle of cleft sections that still showed the fresh pale faces of the split. The yard changed from empty and hopeful to crowded and serious. Halden, the keeper of the oak stand, watched the unloading for a moment. He had come along to ensure nobody celebrated too loudly in the presence of trees that had been turned into work. He gave Bram a nod that might have been approval, or might have been the kind of nod you give when you see someone still alive after a difficult day. Halden left without ceremony. Forest people seldom lingered in shipyards. The forest had its own quiet, and the yard had a different kind of quiet, the kind you had to earn. Ewan set Bram to work clearing the slipway area. Not the rails themselves, but the flat ground just above them where the keel blocks would sit. Bram raked sand, he moved stones, he pulled driftwood aside. He discovered old iron scraps half buried and brought them to the shed, because the yard never truly lost anything. It only mislaid things until someone stepped on them. By mid-morning the workspace was ready. Ewan laid out heavy blocks and wedges. He took a measuring line and stretched it tight. He marked a straight reference along the ground. "Centerline first," he told Bram. "If you do not respect the centerline, the sea will teach you respect." Bram watched the line, thin and taut. It looked too simple to matter. It mattered. They rolled the keel log into position with levers and small controlled shoves. Bram strained until his shoulders burned. Ewan moved with efficient calm, placing wedges under the log as if the log was a tired animal that needed to lie down in the correct spot. The log settled on the blocks. It looked heavy enough to bend the earth. Bram stood back and exhaled. It felt like they had placed the first stone of a house, except the house would later leave and go to sea, which was a strange ambition for a structure. Now, Ewan said, we begin turning tree into keel. He took an axe with a head worn smooth from years of shaping. He did not swing it wildly. He used it like a pen. He scored the bark and sapwood, then peeled away strips, revealing the pale oak beneath. Bram helped, working more slowly, trying to match Ewan's steady rhythm. Chips fell and formed a soft carpet. The scent of fresh oak filled the air and made the shed smell less like old tar and more like possibility. As the day warmed, the yard warmed with it. The fog lifted. Sunlight fell on the log, making it look almost golden. Bram felt a stirring of pride, as if the wood appreciated being admired. "Do not get sentimental," Ewan told him. Bram froze. "How did you know?" "Your hands slowed down," Ewan replied. "Wood does not care about your feelings. It cares about clean cuts." Bram sped up, then immediately slowed again when the axe bounced. He forced himself into a calmer rhythm. They worked the keel into a long beam with a gentle rise at each end. Ewan used an adze to refine the shape, smoothing the curves where the keel would meet the stems. He marked reference points with charcoal. He checked the straightness by sighting down the length, an eye narrowed like a hawk that had decided to become a carpenter. Bram knelt to hold a wedge while Ewan adjusted a block. He watched the keel shift a hair, then settle. That tiny movement mattered, the difference between a ship that ran true and a ship that always felt a little irritated. A voice drifted from the path above the yard. "So this is where the Jarl buys patience." Bram looked up. A man stood on the slope with his hands resting on his belt. He wore a clean tunic, a fine cloak, and a look of practiced confidence. Behind him, two younger men loitered in the manner of people who believed they were witnesses to something important. Ewan did not look up immediately. He kept the adze moving for another slow stroke, then stopped and set it down carefully. "Gareth Stone," Ewan said, without warmth or surprise. Gareth stepped closer, boots still too clean for the yard. "Word travels," he announced. "Rowan wants a new ship. He comes here." Bram felt his own shoulders tighten. Rival builders were not like rival bakers. With bakers, the worst outcome was a bad loaf. With shipwrights, the outcome could be a long swim. "Rowan came here," Ewan replied, "because Rowan wants a ship that does not turn into a story told by survivors." Gareth smiled. "Stories are useful. They make a man sound brave." "Not when the story is about losing cargo and dignity," Ewan said. Gareth glanced at the keel. "Nice oak. You took the best tree, it seems." "We took the straight tree," Ewan corrected. "The forest does not care who gets the best. It only cares who makes the least foolish cut." Gareth stepped closer, eyes on the keel line. "And when will the masterpiece be ready?" "Rowan likes to show things off." "By the time it is ready," Ewan replied, "it will not be a masterpiece. It will be a ship. That is the point." Gareth gave a small laugh. "You always talk like the sea is listening." "The sea is always listening," Ewan replied. "The sea hears everything. It simply does not respond until it is inconvenient." Bram watched Gareth's eyes flick to Bram, then away, dismissive. Bram did not like that. Bram did not like many things, but he was learning to endure them quietly. Gareth shrugged. "Fine, I will let you work. I only came to offer advice." Ewan waited, which made advice look nervous. Gareth cleared his throat. "Clinker hull, I assume, overlaps and rivets and all that tradition." "Yes," Ewan replied. "Then do not make it too narrow," Gareth warned. "Rowan will fill it with barrels, and barrels have no respect for balance." "That is the first useful thing you have said today," Ewan replied. Gareth blinked. He seemed unsure whether that was praise or insult. It was both, which made it difficult to defend against. Gareth turned to leave, then paused. "Rowan will visit again," he announced. "He will bring impatience. Prepare yourself." Ewan gave a small nod. "I prepare myself by continuing to work." Gareth walked away, cloak shifting like a bird. Bram watched until the rival and his shadows disappeared into the path. Bram looked at Ewan. He does that often. People talk when they cannot build, Ewan replied. It fills the space where skill should be. Bram returned his attention to the keel. The oak did not care about Gareth. The oak was busy becoming something else. By afternoon the keel had its true shape, not finished, but ready for the next step. Ewan marked a shallow groove where the first plank would later sit. He worked it carefully, a notch that would guide the garboard strake and help the first plank sit cleanly against the backbone. Bram watched. That groove looks small. Small things decide where the water stays out, Ewan replied. Never trust big things to do all the work. They turned to the stem pieces next. The bow and stern needed strong curved timbers that would rise from the keel and give the ship its proud ends. The pieces were shorter than the keel, but their curves demanded respect. Ewan studied that stem timber, then began shaping it with axe and adze. The curve emerged slowly, like a smile that did not fully trust you yet. Bram took another piece and tried to copy. His first cut bit too deep. The wood made a sound like disappointment. Ewan did not scold. He simply stepped close, put a hand over Bram's wrist, and guided the next swing. Lighter. Let the blade follow. Do not force it. Bram tried again. Better. Ewan gave a small nod. Better is how ships get built. As the sun lowered, the air cooled. The yard grew quiet. The cutters had left. The sea hissed softly on the sand. The gulls settled into their evening arguments. A new set of footsteps approached. Bram turned, expect Gareth again. Instead it was Sini Tarwell. She carried a small bundle of rope samples and a jar with a dark residue that looked like trouble. Her hair was tied back. Her eyes were sharp. Her expression suggested she had already judged the yard and found it acceptable but not impressive. Ewan greeted her with a nod. Signy. Signy looked at the keel, then at the stem pieces, then at Bram. So this is the famous patience, she observed. It looks like oak. It is oak, Bram replied before he could stop himself. Signy looked pleased. Good. If it were pine I would have to lecture you, and lecturing makes me thirsty. She held up the jar. Tar. Good tar. Sticky. Smells like hard work. You will need it. Not today, but soon. Ewan accepted the jar and set it on the bench. How much can you supply? As much as Rowan pays for, Signy replied. Which depends on whether Rowan wants a ship or wants a story. Bram saw Ewan's eyes soften slightly. Not a smile. Something close to trust. Signy glanced toward the bay. Weather will turn. Plan ahead, and tell your apprentice to stop looking like he is waiting for wood to applaud him. Bram flushed. Ewan spoke calmly. Bram is learning, slowly, like everything else. Signy gave Bram a look that was not unkind. Good. Slow is fine. Slow is how you avoid unaliving your own work. Bram nodded quickly. Signy left as she arrived, without ceremony. The yard held her scent for a moment. Tar. Smoke. Rope fibres. Practicality. Ewan and Bram worked another hour, refining surfaces, checking lines, removing tool marks where they mattered. Ewan did not chase perfection. He chased correctness. There was a difference, and Bram was beginning to feel it. When the light faded, Ewan stepped back from the keel and looked down its length again. Bram did the same, mimicking the posture, one eye narrowed. Bram saw a straight line. He also saw 100 places where his own hands could still make mistakes. Ewan set the adze down. Tomorrow we set the stems. Bram tried to imagine the bow rising. It felt too soon, and also not soon enough. Ewan walked to the slipway rails and rested a hand on the dark timber. This rail has seen many ships, he murmured. It has seen some foolish ones too. It did not unalive them. The sea handled that part. Bram swallowed. So the keel is the beginning. The keel is the start of the argument, Ewan replied. After that, we convince wood and iron and water to cooperate. Bram looked at the keel again. It lay on its blocks like a sleeping animal, heavy, quiet, full of future motion. Ewan turned toward the shed. Eat, rest. Tomorrow we lift the ends and give this ship its posture. Bram nodded. He felt tired in his arms and calm in his mind. It was the good kind of tired, the kind that let a person sleep without wrestling their own thoughts. Outside, Alder Bay breathed with the tide. The keel waited, the sea waited. Everything that mattered took its time. Chapter 4. The First Strakes, or How to Build Outside First. Morning returned with a cool wind that smelled of salt and distant rain. The bay was clear, the tide was low. The yard felt quiet in the way a room feels quiet right before music begins. Bram arrived early again and tried to look calm about it. He swept the work area, not because it needed sweeping, but because his hands wanted to do something while his mind tried to race ahead. Ewan arrived with the same steady pace as always. He looked at the keel, then at the stem pieces, then at Bram. He nodded once, which Bram took as permission to continue being alive. Today, Ewan told him, we make it look like a ship. Bram felt a shiver of excitement. He tried to hide it. He failed. First, they set the stems. Ewan and Bram levered the bow piece into position at one end of the keels. Ewan checked the angle with a line and a simple wooden gauge. He adjusted with wedges. Bram held the piece steady, arms trembling from the strain and from the fear of letting it slip. Slow, Ewan reminded him. A ship does not like sudden decisions. When the bow stem sat true, they fastened it temporarily with clamps and lashings. They repeated the process at the stern, setting the aft stem so the keel rose into it cleanly. Bram stepped back and stared. The backbone had ends now. The shape was still skeletal, but it had posture. It looked as if it might soon stand up and start giving orders. Ewan walked around it, checking both sides. He adjusted a wedge by a hair. Bram hardly saw the change, but he saw Ewan's satisfaction. Now, Ewan said, we begin the shell. Bram remembered the Jarl question, why build outside first? Bram looked at the empty space where ribs might have been. It still felt strange. Ewan read his face. Frame first is a fine method for some places, he explained, but clinker hull starts with planks. The planks carry the shape, the overlaps give strength. Later the frames support what the planks already decided. Bram nodded. So the planks decide. The planks and the builder, Ewan corrected. Do not give wood too much credit. Wood will take it. They moved to a cleft plank section and began turning it into the first strake. Ewan chose carefully, picking a piece with straight grain and even thickness. He worked it with axe, then refined with edges. The sound of the blade against wood was steady, like a slow drum. Bram helped with the drawknife, pulling the blade toward himself in controlled strokes while the plank rested on a shaving horse. Fresh curls fell to the ground, pale and soft. Ewan checked thickness by feel and by eye. Not too thin, not too thick. The first strake had to sit against the keel cleanly. It had to be strong enough to take stress. It had to be cooperative, which was a rare trait in any material. This first wood, Ewan told Bram, matters more than people think. It sets the tone. If it is wrong, everything above it becomes a correction. Corrections multiply. Bram tried to imagine corrections multiplying. He did not like the image. They carried the shaped plank to the keel. Ewan held it against the groove he had cut the day before. The fit was close but not perfect. It never was perfect at first. Wood was real. Reality always arrived with small gaps. Ewan marked spots with charcoal where it needed trimming. Bram watched, learning how Ewan could see the difference between a good fit and a fit that only looked good from a distance. Back to the bench, Ewan instructed. Trim. Test. Trim. This is the rhythm. Bram tried not to sigh. He reminded himself that sighing was wasted air, and Ewan disliked wasted air. They repeated the steps. The plank slowly learned its place. Then came bending. The strake needed to follow the curve of the keel and rise toward the stems. Oak did not like bending just because someone wanted it to. Oak needed persuasion. Ewan built a small bending setup near the shed, a low trough and a covered space where steam and heat could do their quiet work. He did not over-explain. He simply prepared it, as if heat was another tool. They warmed the plank and kept it damp. Bram held the far end while Ewan guided the curve into place with ropes and clamps. The plank resisted, then gave a little, then resisted again. It made soft creaking sounds, like an old man standing up. Bram held his breath. Ewan stayed calm. Listen to it. If it complains too sharply, we stop. If it complains politely, we continue. Bram nodded, eyes wide. The plank seemed to complain politely, which Bram considered generous. They clamped the strake into position and let it rest, still warm, still in a new shape that it would slowly accept. While it rested, Ewan prepared the next strake. The plank above would overlap the one below. That overlap was the signature of the build. It was also the part that made the hull look like it had layered armour, which made sponsors feel confident even if they did not understand why. Bram helped shave the next plank. He found a steadier rhythm now. His hands began to move with less eager force and more controlled pressure. He noticed the difference in sound when the blade was cutting cleanly versus scraping. He adjusted without needing a lecture, which felt like a personal victory. Ewan noticed. He did not praise, he simply gave Bram a slightly heavier task, which was a form of praise in this yard. By midday, the first strake was ready to be fastened. The fastening was not final yet. The ironwork would come in full force later, but they used temporary fastenings and a few early rivets where needed to hold the shape. Ewan lined up the holes carefully. He used an auger with controlled pressure, drilling through the plank and into the keel groove area where the fit demanded security. Bram held a backing piece and tried not to move, because moving would make the hole wrong, and wrong holes never became right again without making the wood tired. When the first fastening went in, the plank felt real. It was no longer a piece of timber. It was part of a hull. Bram touched the edge lightly. It feels different now, because it belongs, Ewan replied. Belonging changes things. They continued with the next strake. The overlap line had to be clean. The bevel had to be correct so the upper plank sat over the lower plank without leaving a gap that would later become a slow leak and an embarrassing story. Bram held the plank while Ewan checked the overlap. Ewan ran fingertips along the seam like reading it. He adjusted with small shaves. Bram watched every motion. "Why do you touch it like that?" Bram asked. "Because my fingers notice what my eyes forgive," Ewan replied. "Eyes like to be optimistic. Fingers are honest." Bram tried it. He ran his fingers along a seam. He felt a slight step. He did not see it at first. Then he saw it. The seam was prowled by a thin edge. Bram looked up, startled. Ewan nodded. "Good. Now you are learning to be disappointed in the right places." Bram tried not to laugh. He failed quietly. They set the second strake in place. More heat, more rope, more gentle persuasion. The oak complained politely again. Bram began to understand that polite complaining was the best outcome. As the shell rose, even by 2 strakes, the shape began to appear. The keel no longer looked lonely. The stems no longer looked like separate pieces. The hull began to cradle air. A shadow fell across the yard. Bram looked up to see Jarl Rowan standing at the edge of the work area, his cloak pulled close against the wind. 2 guards stood behind him. The scribe was there too, stylus ready, as if wood could be convinced to move faster by recording its progress. Rowan took in the scene. The keel, the stems, the first strakes clamped and held, the tools, the curls of oak on the ground like pale ribbons. "So it begins," Rowan observed. "It began in the forest," Ewan replied. "This is the part you can see." Rowan stepped closer, careful now, boots less clean than last time. He crouched to look at the overlap line. His expression shifted. He looked pleased and also a little uneasy. He was seeing something become real, and real things came with real limits. "How long before it looks like a ship?" Rowan asked. "It looks like a ship now," Bram blurted. Ewan glanced at Bram. Bram closed his mouth. Ewan turned back to Rowan. "It will look more like what you imagine after several more strakes and the hull rises to full height. It will not look like a finished ship until we have the interior, the thwarts, the mast step, the steering, the caulking, the tar, and the rig." Rowan frowned slightly, as if listing tasks was rude. Ewan continued, voice steady. "The sea does not accept half work, neither should you." Rowan stood. "The overlap," he said, "that makes it strong." "It helps," Ewan replied. The overlaps and the fastenings create a structure that carries strength along the hull. The shell can flex. Flexing is not weakness, it is survival. Rowan looked out toward the bay. He looked like he wanted the sea to sign a contract. The sea stayed quiet. Rowan turned back. Gareth Stone told me you build too slowly. Ewan did not change expression. Gareth Stone talks too quickly. Rowan almost smiled. Then build quickly enough that my rivals stop smiling at me. Ewan nodded once. We will build correctly. Correctly is faster than rebuilding after a mistake. Rowan studied the clamps and ropes holding the straight curve. That plank, he noted. It wants to spring back. It wants to be a tree again, Ewan replied. We are teaching it new manners. Rowan nodded as if new manners were a familiar problem. Very well, continue. He began to leave, then paused. My people brought more iron. The blacksmith will come soon. Ewan gave a small nod. Good. Rowan walked away. The guards followed. The scribe lingered long enough to stare at the hull shape for one long breath, then hurried after the jarl because scribes preferred not to be abandoned near sharp tools. Bram watched them go. He spoke softly. He worries. Sponsors worry because they want control, Ewan replied. Building a ship teaches them they do not have it. The afternoon light shifted. The wind eased. The yard returned to its quieter rhythm. They added the next strake, then another. Each one required shaping, fitting, and persuasion. Each one demanded patience and rewarded it with a clearer hull line. Bram began to notice how the hull widened through the middle and narrowed toward the ends. It was like watching a creature grow from spine outward. The shell-first method no longer felt strange. It felt inevitable. Late in the day, a plank fought them. It resisted the bend near the bow. It creaked with sharper complaint. Bram held the rope while Ewan eased pressure and adjusted the angle. Bram felt sweat on his palms. Is it going to split? Not if we stop trying to win, Ewan replied. We are not in a contest with the wood. We are in a negotiation. Ewan loosened the clamps, warmed the plank again, and tried a different approach. He guided the bend in smaller steps. The plank complained politely again, which felt like mercy. When it finally sat correctly, Bram released a slow breath he had been holding too long. Ewan looked at Bram. Do not fear every sound. It sounded like it was angry, Bram admitted. It sounded like it was alive, Ewan corrected. Wood makes noise. Ships make noise. The sea makes noise. Silence is not the goal. Control is the goal. Bram nodded, calmer. As evening approached, the hull stood a little higher, just enough to cast a new shadow on the sand. The ship was still low, still open, still incomplete. But it was no longer an idea drawn in charcoal or sand. It was a structure beginning to claim its place. Ewan walked around it slowly, checking both sides. He ran a hand along the overlap lines. He adjusted the clamp by a small turn. He removed a shaving from a spot that only his fingers would notice. Bram watched with quiet admiration. He wanted to become that kind of calm, the calm that came from competence and not from pretending. Ewan set down his tools. That is enough for today. Bram looked at the half-hull. It feels like stopping in the middle of a sentence. It is stopping at the end of a good paragraph, Ewan replied. If you keep writing when you are tired, your words get sloppy. Wood works the same way. Bram nodded reluctantly. They covered the fresh planks lightly to keep the night damp from changing them too quickly. The yard settled. The bay quieted. The tide shifted. The gulls became less certain and more sleepy. Bram stood beside the hull for a final moment. He traced the curve with his eyes. He imagined future strakes rising higher, the full belly of the ship, the frames that would later join the shell like ribs joining a chest. He imagined rowing benches and a mast and a sail that would one day fill with wind and carry this careful work into wider water. Ewan stood beside him, hands resting at his sides. He spoke softly, almost to the ship. Outside first, he murmured. Layer by layer, the shell holds the story. The inside comes after. Bram felt his own mind slow. The day had been full of small decisions, small cuts, small corrections. It was tiring, and it was also strangely peaceful. The work demanded attention so completely that it left little room for anxious thoughts. Ewan turned toward the shed. Eat. Rest. Tomorrow we add more strakes. The ship will rise the way it should, not the way Rowan wishes. Bram gave a quiet nod. He liked that. He liked the thought that the ship answered to craft, not to impatience. Outside, Alder Bay breathed with the tide. The new planks held their curves. The shell stood low and steady, beginning to look like something that would carry weight and still move, a calm argument against the chaos of the sea. Chapter 5. Rivets and Roves. The blacksmith joins the drama. The hull rose slowly at Alder Bay, plank over plank, overlap over overlap, like a patient animal learning its own shape. The shell-first method looked strange to anyone who expected ribs and bones before skin. To Ewan, it looked like the only honest way to do it. The planks carried the story. The inside would come later, once the outside had decided it was serious. Bram learned the rhythm. Shape, fit, warm, bend, clamp, test, adjust, then do it again, because the sea had never been impressed by a first attempt. His hands grew steadier, his mind grew quieter. He still felt excitement, but it no longer spilled out of him like water from a poorly seated seam. On the morning the blacksmith arrived, the yard sounded different. Louder exactly, sharper. Metal brought its own voice and it wanted attention. A cart creaked down the path into the cove carrying iron bars, a small anvil, a box of tongs, and a man who looked like he had been made from the same material he worked. His shoulders were broad, his arms were dark with old soot. His gaze moved over the hull like he was measuring the places where wood would ask metal to behave. Ewan met him near the shed. Tolan Ford. Ewan greeted him. Tolan set the anvil down with the care of someone placing a sleeping child. Ewan Ashford. I hear you want enough rivets to stitch the sea out of a hull. Ewan gave a small nod. I want enough rivets to keep the sea from stitching its way in. Tolan grunted approval. Bram watched closely. Ewan trusted very few people. He trusted Tolan, which meant Tolan had earned it by doing work that did not need excuses. Tolan walked to the hull and ran a hand along the overlap line. He felt the edge where one plank lay over the other, the thin step that made clinker hulls look layered and confident. This is good work, Tolan said. Bram felt pride rise like a bubble. He tried to keep it from popping. Tolan looked at Bram, who was the quiet one. Bram blinked. Me. Tolan nodded slowly. Good. Quiet hands make straight rivet lines. Bram did not know if that was praise, but he decided to accept it as such. They set up Tolan work area near the shed where the wind could carry smoke away. The forge was a small affair, enough to heat iron without turning the whole yard into a dramatic festival. Tolan did not need a large forge. He needed heat, rhythm, and the kind of focus that made other people feel like they should leave him alone. Soon the first iron glowed in the heart of the fire. Tolan pulled it out with tongs. It was bright and alive, a small sun in his hands. He set it on the anvil and began shaping it with controlled hammer blows. Clang, clang, clang. A steady beat, not frantic, not angry, firm and sure. Bram watched, fascinated. He had expected more sparks and noise. Tolan worked like a man who knew that drama wasted energy. Ewan stood beside Bram. Rivets and roves, he explained quietly. The rivet is the nail, the rove is the small plate, like a washer, that sits on the inside. The rivet passes through plank and overlap, then through the rove, then we clinch the end. We mushroom it down so it locks. Metal on both sides, wood held tight. Bram nodded. So the overlap is not just sitting there. No, Ewan replied. The overlap is a joint. The rivets make it a decision. Tolan worked through a handful of rivets first, making them in lengths and thicknesses Ewan requested. Each rivet looked simple, but Bram began to see how much judgment lived in a simple piece of iron. Too thin and it would bend, too thick and it would split wood or refuse to seat properly, too short and it would not clinch, too long and it would curl and make a mess. Tolan set finished rivets into a tray like coins. Then he began making roves, small plates with holes. They were plain and honest. They did not need beauty. They needed strength. When the tray held enough to begin, Ewan led Bram to the hull. The shell had risen to several strakes now. It stood low but unmistakable, a cradle of air and future movement. The overlap lines ran along it like quiet seams. Today, Ewan told Bram, you learn to make holes that matter. Bram swallowed. He already knew holes could ruin work faster than any storm. Ewan set a marking line along the plank overlap. Rivets go in a line, he explained. Even spacing. Not too close to the edge, or the wood will split. Not too far, or the overlap will lift. The line must be true. A wandering rivet line is a confession. Bram looked at the marks. They were neat, measured and consistent. He wondered how many years it took to make marks that looked that calm. Ewan handed Bram the auger. You drill, I will watch. If you drift, I will be disappointed in a way you will remember. Bram nodded quickly. He pressed the auger to the first mark. He began turning, careful and slow. Walk. The bit bit into wood, he kept it straight. He tried to keep his breath steady. A clean hole emerged. Bram felt relief. Ewan touched the rim lightly. Good. Next. Bram moved to the next mark. He drilled again, another clean hole. By the fourth hole, Bram began to feel confident. Confidence arrived at the exact moment it should not. The auger bit. Bram pushed a little too hard. The bit caught. The handle jerked. The hole shifted a hair. Bram froze. Ewan leaned in. He looked at the hole. He did not speak immediately. That silence was worse than shouting. Bram whispered, "Is it ruined?" Ewan stayed calm. "It is not ruined. It is a warning. You pushed when you should have turned. Turning is how we work. Pushing is how we break." Bram nodded, cheeks warm with shame. Ewan set a small wedge under the plank to support it. Drill again, carefully. True the hole with the reamer. Then we continue. Bram obeyed. He drilled with steadier hands. He reamed gently. The hole became round and honest again. "Better," Ewan said. "Better is how you survive learning." They continued drilling holes along the overlap line. Tolan brought a handful of rivets and stood ready, his heavy hands surprisingly delicate when he handled the iron. "Now we fasten," Ewan told Bram. "This is a two-person job. One holds outside, one clinches inside. Tolan will strike. You will learn the rhythm." Bram went inside the hull, crouching under the rising shell. It felt strange in there. The planks curved around him. Light filtered through gaps near the shear where the upper strakes were not yet in place. The smell of fresh oak mixed with the smoke of the forge. Tolan pushed a rivet through the first hole from the outside. The rivet tip appeared inside. Bram held a rove plate. He slid it onto the rivet. It sat snug against the wood. "Now," Ewan instructed, "set it firm, then peen. Light taps. We do not smash, we persuade." Bram held the small peening hammer. He tapped the rivet end. Tap, tap, tap. The rivet end began to spread slightly. Tolan held the outside head with a heavy iron dolly to keep it seated. His presence outside was like an anchor. Ewan watched Bram's hands. Keep the angle, keep the rhythm, feel it. Bram tapped again. The rivet end spread more. It began to mushroom over the rove. The rove hugged the wood. The joint tightened. Bram felt a quiet thrill. The overlap was no longer two planks leaning on each other. It was locked. "Good," Ewan murmured. "That one will hold." They moved to the next rivet. Bram repeated the steps. Slide rove. Tap, tap, tap. Check. Tap again. Each one was a small ritual. Each one asked for patience. After several, Bram began to hear the sound of correct peening. A sharper ring meant the rivet was seated. A dull thud meant something was wrong, a gap or a soft spot. He began to adjust before Ewan had to speak, which felt like a private victory. Tolan offered a gruff observation from outside. "You learn fast, quiet one." Bram tried not to smile too hard. "Thank you." "Do not thank me," Tolan replied. "Thank the iron for cooperating. It rarely does." They worked along a full section of overlap, the yard filled with alternating sounds. The forge breath, the hammer beat, the soft tap of peening, the occasional scrape of tool on wood. By midday, Bram muscles trembled, his knees ached from crouching inside the hull. He emerged from the shell and stood up slowly, as if his body had forgotten what standing felt like. Ewan handed him water. "Drink, then rest your hands. You cannot peen well with tired fingers." Bram drank. The water tasted like simple mercy. Tolan wiped sweat from his brow with the back of his wrist, leaving a streak of soot. He looked at the rivet line. "Good enough. For now." "For now," Ewan agreed. "We continue tomorrow and the next day and the next day until the hull is stitched with iron." Bram glanced at the growing tray of rivets. "How many?" Ewan looked at the hull. "Many. A ship is not built by one heroic blow. It is built by many small correct ones." Bram nodded, feeling the bedtime calm settle back in. The repetitive nature of the work was soothing. It was like counting waves, each one similar, each one slightly different. The afternoon brought a small setback, because afternoons enjoyed that sort of thing. A plank line near the bow began to look wrong, not in shape, in the rivet spacing. Bram spotted it first, which was both good and uncomfortable. "Ewan!" Bram called softly. Ewan stepped over and followed Bram's finger. The marks were a little too close to the edge, not dangerously close yet, but close enough that the wood might split later under stress. Ewan's eyes narrowed. "Who marked this section?" Bram hesitated. "I did." Ewan nodded slowly. The nod did not feel like kindness. It felt like truth. "What did you forget?" Ewan asked. Bram stared at the plank. The curve near the bow, he realized. The overlap line shifted slightly there. The edge was closer than it looked from above. Ewan gave a small approving nod. "Correct. The curve changes the relationship. Straight rules become crooked mistakes if you apply them without thinking." Bram swallowed. "Do we redo it?" "We correct it," Ewan replied. "We do not pretend it will be fine. Fine is the word people use right before water arrives." Ewan took a small wooden plug and fitted it into the first hole in the wrong line. He trimmed it flush. He did the same for the next. He sealed them with a smear of resin. The work was quiet, careful, and slightly humiliating in the way all good learning was. Tolan watched, then grunted. "Better to fix now." Ewan nodded. "Better to fix now." They shifted the rivet line slightly inward for that section. Bram redid the marks under Ewan's watchful eye. This time he followed the curve and measured the edge distance with a simple gauge. When the corrected holes were drilled and the rivets seated, the line looked true again. Bram felt relief, and also a new respect for the way mistakes hid in places that looked harmless. Late afternoon, Jarl Rowan arrived again. He stood at the yard edge and watched the blacksmith work as if he was seeing a strange ritual performed for his benefit. His guards stayed back. The scribe watched the forge like it might begin writing on its own. Rowan approached the hull and touched the outside rivet heads lightly. They felt smooth and firm. "So this is what holds it," Rowan observed. "Iron pins." Ewan nodded. "Iron and good wood and correct work." Rowan looked at Tolan. "Are you the one making the iron?" Tolan did not bow. He did not smile. He simply met Rowan's gaze. "I make what Ewan needs. If I make it poorly, the sea will make me regret it. I prefer not to regret things." Rowan seemed to like that. He looked back at the hull. "It is taking shape." "It is," Ewan replied. "Shaping takes time. Fastening takes time. You cannot have a strong ship with a rushed hull unless you also want a rushed sinking." Rowan's mouth twitched, amused and annoyed at the same time. "Gareth Stone says you scare sponsors." Ewan kept his face calm. "Sponsors scare themselves. I just help them hear it." Rowan looked as if he wanted to argue, then decided to be practical. "How soon before the hull is fully fastened?" Ewan looked at the work left. "We will fasten as we rise. The hull will be riveted along each overlap. The work is steady. It cannot be hurried without becoming sloppy." Rowan exhaled. "Continue, and do not let my ship become a lesson told at Tunsberg." Ewan gave a small nod. "Your ship will become a ship. Lessons are optional." Rowan left, his cloak shifting as he walked. Bram watched him go and felt the pressure settle back over the yard like a thin blanket. Deadlines did not stay long, but they always left their scent. As evening came, Tolan banked the forge and packed his tools. He would return in the morning. Rivets needed making and the hull needed stitching. Bram stood by the finished rivet line and ran his fingers along the outside heads. They were small, neat, even. The line looked almost decorative, which made Bram uneasy. Anything that looked decorative was usually hiding how much work it had cost. Tolan caught Bram looking. "Do not get romantic about rivets, quiet why." Bram blinked. "I was not." Tolan grunted. "Good. Rivets are not romance, rivets are duty." Ewan covered the work with a tarp and weighted it with stones. The wind rose slightly off the water. The bay turned darker. The tide shifted. Bram felt the calm heaviness of a day spent repeating a skill until it began to live in his hands. Ewan walked beside Bram toward the shed. "Today you learned something important." Bram waited. Ewan spoke softly. "A ship is not held together by a strong piece. It is held by many small honest ones. If you lie in thy place, the sea finds it." Bram nodded, mind quiet. Outside, Alder Bay breathed with the tide. Inside the yard, iron held wood. Wood held shape. Shape held the promise of motion. The hull rose in steady silence, stitched by rivets that did not care about rival jarls or spring gatherings. They cared only about being correct. Chapter 6. Frames come later, like wisdom. Rain arrived in the night, and did not bother to introduce itself. By morning the yard was damp, the sand darkened, the smell of wet oak rising like a calm reminder that wood was still alive in its own slow way. Bram stepped into the shed and found Euron already theyed, sharpening a blade with steady strokes. The sound was soft and regular, like a lullaby for tools. "Rain day," Bram observed. Euron glanced toward the doorway where the grey sky hung low. "A good day. The wood stays damp, it bends without sulking. Also fewer visitors arrive to announce opinions." Bram smiled. He could not argue with that. Tolan arrived anyway, because blacksmiths were not visitors, they were necessities. He brought a fresh tray of rivets and roves, and a face that looked as if the rain had tried to insult him and failed. They continued fastening as they rose. Each new strake brought new holes, new rivets, new small correct taps. Bram settled into the routine. His hands knew the weight of the peening hammer now. He could feel when the rivet end was ready to spread and when it needed dead more gentle strike. He could hear the difference between seated and uncertain. The hull rose to the point where Bram had to crouch lower inside. The shell wrapped around him like a wooden room, curved and quiet. Light came in through the open top and through small gaps that would later be sealed. The sound of rain on the outside planks made a soft drumming, soothing and steady. By midday, Ewan stepped back and studied the hull. The shell was high enough now that it held its shape firmly. The overlap lines were set. The iron held each seam tight. The ship looked like it was ready to be something more than a shell. "Now," Euron told Bram, "we begin the part people forget." Bram looked around. More planks. "Not yet," Euron replied. "Now we give it ribs." Bram blinked. "But we are building shell first." "We did," Euron replied. "Now we do what shell first requires. We frame the inside after the outside knows what it is." Bram felt a quiet excitement. He had been waiting for the moment when the ship would begin to feel like a place, not just a shape. Euron walked into the hull and rested a hand on an inner plank. "The shell holds the water out," he explained. "The frames help the shell keep its will. They spread loads, they give strength against twisting, they support thwarts and deck areas, but they must fit the shape we already made. We do not force the hull to fit the frames, we fit the frames to the hull." Bram nodded slowly. "So wisdom comes later." Euron gave him a brief look. "Wisdom comes when you stop pretending you had it at the start." They began preparing frame timbers. Some were naturally curved pieces grown that way in the tree, useful for knees and supports. Others were straight pieces that would be steamed and bent to match the hull shape. Euron chose them carefully from the timber stack, feeling grain and flex with his hands. Bram carried pieces into the shed where they could work out of the rain. The shed smelled of wet wood, iron, and the faint sweetness of fresh shavings. It was not a bad smell, It was the smell of things becoming useful. Euron laid a frame timber on the bench. He marked it with charcoal. This will become men rib. It needs to curve to the hull, not too tight, not too loose. It must press against the shell evenly. Bram asked, "How do you know the curve?" Euron pointed at the hull. "We take it from the ship. We use a pattern stick. We measure the inside width at each station. We test fit, we trim, we test again." Bram felt a familiar rhythm returning. Trim, test, trim, test. It was like the planks all over again, only now the work was inside and the pieces were smaller and the consequences were still large. They set up the steaming trough again, warming water and guiding steam into a covered space. The rain helped. Everything stayed damp and cooperative. When the first frame timber was warm, they carried it into the hull. Euron positioned it against the inner planks. Bram held that end while Euron guided the other. The timber resisted, then softened, then settled into a curve. "Hold it," Euron instructed. Bram held it. His arms trembled. The timber pushed against him like a stubborn animal. Euron applied clamps and temporary lashings to keep the frame pressed against the hull. He checked contact points with his fingers. "Note the," Euron murmured. "Trim that spot. It is proud." Bram took the draw knife and shaved a small area. He took off less than he wanted to, because he remembered the earlier lesson about pushing. He returned the frame to place. "Better contact." Euron nodded. "Better." They repeated this with the next frame. Each bun had its own mood. Some fit easily, some fought. Bram began to see that the hull shape changed subtly along its length. The middle was fuller, the ends tightened. The frames needed to match each station, each curve. While they worked, Toland continued making rivets and staying out of the way. Blacksmiths had the rare skill of being both essential and invisible when needed. By afternoon the rain eased. The yard lightened. The bay looked calm again, as if it had never been wet. That was the moment Jarl Rowan arrived, because sponsors had a gift for timing. He appeared at the yard edge with his guards and scribe, cloak pulled close, expression determined to look patient. Euron did not stop working. He fit a frame and checked its contact, calm and unhurried. Rowan stepped closer and peered into the hull. "Ribs now," he observed. "Frames," Euron corrected. "Ribs are for animals, this is for a ship." Rowan's mouth twitched. "It looks cramped." "It is not a hall," Euron replied. "It is a vessel. The sea does not offer extra space for comfort." Rowan leaned closer. "Why not build frames first like other boats?" Bram held his breath. Euron had answered this before. Rowan apparently needed to hear it again, as many important people did. Euron kept his voice steady. "Because clinker shell carries strength along the planks. The overlaps and rivets create a shell that holds its shape and flexes with waves. Frames come after to support, not to dictate. This makes a hull that is strong and light enough to beach when needed." Rowan nodded, half satisfied. "And these frames, they will be fixed in?" "Yes," Euron replied. "We will fasten them to the shell. We will use tree nails in some places and lashings where tradition and function call for it. We will add floors and knees. We will add thwarts. The inside will become a structure. But it will follow the shape you already paid for." Rowan looked at Bram. "Apprentice, can you stand up in they?" Bram glanced at the low hull. "Not comfortably." Rowan frowned. "My rivals will laugh if I arrive hunched like a crab." Euron looked at Rowan with quiet patience. "Your rivals will laugh regardless. People who laugh at others do it because they have nothing else to offer. If you want to stand upright, build a house." Rowan stared. Then he laughed, short and reluctant, like admitting he had been caught being foolish. "Fine. I will arrive like a sensible crab." Bram almost smiled too hard. He kept it small. Rowan stepped back, eyes scanning the yard. "Gareth Stone says you waste time with details." Euron's voice remained calm. "Gareth Stone wastes time with words." Rowan nodded, as if that was a familiar truth. "How many frames before it is done?" "Enough," Euron replied. "Not more, not fewer." Rowan held his patience like a heavy object. "And the deadline." Euron continued fitting the frame without looking up. The deadline will be met if the work stays correct. If you want it faster, you can ask the sea to become more forgiving. Rowan exhaled. The sea is not forgiving. Correct, Ewan replied. Neither am I, when it matters. Rowan watched a moment longer, then turned to leave. He paused at the yard edge and looked back. Make it good. Ewan gave a small nod. Always. After Rowan left, the yard felt lighter, as if a thin rope had been removed from around its shoulders. Bram shifted his grip on the frame timber. It is strange, Bram murmured, how he can make the air feel heavier by standing in it. That is a sponsor skill, Ewan replied. If he could build ships, he would not need it. They continued, frame after frame, fit, trim, clamp, check. The work was slow, but it was calm. The hull began to feel different as frames went in. It no longer felt like a shell that could be dented by careless hands. It felt like a structure with bones, quietly gaining confidence. As evening approached, Ewan began setting permanent fastenings for the first frames. He drilled carefully through frame and plank where required, then used fastenings that would hold without splitting the shell. He worked with the same controlled patience he used with planks. Bram asked, "Why not lock everything rigid? Would that not be strongest?" Ewan paused, then spoke softly. "Rigid things break when waves insist. A ship needs strength and it needs give. Flexing is not weakness. Flexing is how it stays whole." Bram nodded. He thought of trees bending in wind. He thought of the way the hull had creaked and complained politely, and then accepted its shape. Flexing was a kind of agreement with reality. They added a knee piece, naturally curved, bracing a spot where stress would gather. Ewan fitted it neatly. Bram watched the way the curve matched the hull and frame like it belonged there. He began to understand why Holden had pointed out fallen logs for knees and blocks. Curved wood saved work and added strength because it followed the grain that nature had already arranged. Tolan packed his tools and left before dark, his work done for the day. The forge went quiet. Without the metal sounds, the yard returned to the softer voice of wood and watered. Bram stood inside the hull and ran a hand along the newly set frame. The timber felt warm from his touch. It pressed against the inner plank with firm contact. No gap, no lie. "It feels like a room now," Bram murmured. Ewan stepped into the hull beside him. "Not a room, but yes. It begins to feel like a place. That is when people start getting attached. Attachment is fine as long as it does not make you careless." Bram nodded. Ewan looked up through the open top at the darkening sky. "Enough for today. The frames we set will settle overnight. The hull will rest. Tomorrow we continue." Bram climbed out carefully. He looked back at the ship. The shell stood higher now. The overlap lines caught the last light. Inside, the first frames curved like quiet ribs, turning the hull into a bodied. The bay outside was calm. The tide moved without hurry. The yard smelled of wet oak and old tar and iron that had cooled. It smelled like progress made slowly enough to last. Ewan covered the hull again. He weighted the tarp. He checked lashings and clamps one more time. Bram watched, mind quiet. He felt the same steady tiredness as before, a tiredness that made sleep feel easy. Ewan spoke softly as they headed toward the shed. "People think shipbuilding is about bravery and speed. It is mostly about noticing a gap, noticing a twist, noticing when your hands get impatient." Bram nodded. "Noticing is hard." Ewan gave him a brief look. "Noticing is the job. Everything else is just tools." Outside, Alder Bay breathed with the tide. Inside the yard, the ship gained its inner strength, frame by frame, like wisdom arriving after the loud parts of youth had calmed down. Chapter 7. Keeping the sea outside, politely. The shipyard woke to a smell that made Bram feel both comforted and suspicious. It was the smell of tar warming in a pot. It was the smell of rope fibre. It was the smell of work that did not look impressive from far away, but decided whether you arrived home dry. The hull sat on its blocks like it had always belonged there. The shell stood tall now, strakes rising to the sheer. Inside, frames curved in steady intervals. Thwarts were beginning to appear, simple beams that would become seats and structure. The ship was no longer a shape you could deny, it was a presence. Ewan moved around it with the calm precision of a man who enjoyed problems only when they behaved. He checked seams with his fingertips. He checked rivet lines with his eyes. He checked the frames where they met the shell. He did not hurry, he did not chat. Bram hovered nearby with a bundle of oakum like it was a newborn animal. "What is oakum again?" Bram asked, softly, because he suspected loud question aged a man prematurely. Ewan glanced at the bundle. "It is fibre. Wool, hair, flax, whatever you can get that has bite. We pack it into the seams where the sea wants to explore." Bram looked at the hull. The overlap lines seemed tight already, the rivets sat neat, the planks looked like they trusted each other. "So why do we still need it?" Bram asked. "Because wood is honest," Ewan replied, "and honesty includes moving when it gets wet and moving again when it dries. Because rivets hold planks together, but they do not fill every tiny gap. And because the sea is patient and rude." Bram nodded. He could accept patient. He did not like rude. Signe Tarwell arrived at mid-morning with a cart that smelled like it had been dragged through a forest fire, and then dipped in a barrel of pine resin. Her helper pushed the cart while Signe walked beside it, as if the cart was lucky to keep up. She wore a simple tunic. Her hands were stained dark. Her hair was tied back tight. She carried herself like someone who had never needed permission. Ewan greeted her with a nod. Signe looked at the hull, then at the seam lines, then at Bram. "You are still alive," she observed. Bram gave a careful nod. "Yes." "Good," Signe replied. "Boats like builders who remain alive." Her helper set down a pot of tar and a bundle of tools, caulking irons, wooden mallets, a ladle for tar, a brush made from coarse fibres. Scene touched the tar pot lid with wide finger. Warm it slowly. Too hot and it goes thin and angry. Too cool and it goes stiff and useless. The correct temperature is always slightly inconvenient. Bram stared at the pot like it might prove her wrong. The pot remained silent. Ewan stepped to the hull and pointed along a seam. "We start low, we work up. We do not skip, and we do not pretend a gap is charming." Scene gave him a quick approving look, then she looked at Bram again. "You, quiet one, you will pack the seam. Not hard, not soft. You will pack it like you mean it." Bram swallowed. "Like I mean it." Scene nodded. "Exactly. People think sealing a ship is just stuffing fibre into cracks. It is not. It is choosing how the hull will breathe. Too tight and you split something. Too loose and you invite water to live with you." Bram did not want water as a roommate. They began inside the hull where the overlaps met, and where small seams waited for attention. Ewan showed Bram the angle of the caulking iron. The tool looked simple, a thin blade meant to push fibre into a seam without destroying it. "You do not stab the seam," Ewan told him. "You guide, tap and press, tap and press. The seam accepts fibre if you behave like a guest. If you arrive like a raider, it will punish you later." Bram nodded, trying to imagine raiding a seam. The image was silly and therefore memorable. Signe worked nearby with swift confidence. Her mallet taps were steady and light, like a musician practicing a simple pattern. She moved along a seam and left behind a neat line of packed fibre. It looked so easy that Bram felt offended. Bram tried. He placed the iron at the seam and tapped. The fibre slid in. He tapped again. It went deeper. He tried a harder tap and the iron jumped. Ewan held up a hand. Calm. Bram slowed. Tap, press, tap, press. The fibre began to seat properly. "Better," Signe observed without looking up. "Do not ruin it by becoming proud." Bram kept his pride in his pocket where it could not interfere. The work was repetitive in the best way. A seam, fibre, tap, a little more fibre, tap, move along. The sound of mallets on irons became a soft rhythm inside the hull. Outside, the tide made its own quiet noises against the shore. Bram found his thoughts slowing as his hands followed the pattern. The ship held him like a wooden cave. Light filtered in from the open top. The air smelled of oak, rope fibre and warm tar. It was strangely soothing, like being inside a giant instrument. Signy paused to check bramline. She pressed a fingertip along the seam. It felt firm, newt-crushed, not loose. "That will do," she told him. "Do not celebrate. Celebrate later when you are dry in a storm." Bram gave a small nod. He liked practical approval. Ewan moved to a seam near the bow where the curvature tightened. He worked more slowly there. The wood was under different stresses. The overlaps changed their angle. The gap size varied by small amounts that mattered in the way a single loose tooth mattered. Bram watched Ewan choose a slightly thinner strand of fibre for that seam. "How do you know?" Bram asked. Ewan did not stop tapping. "Because the seam tells you. It is narrow there. If you force thick fibre, you pry it open. Then you have created the gap you wanted to fill. You see the problem?" Bram nodded. Creating a problem to solve it sounded like something a sponsor might do. They worked through midday. They stopped only to drink water and eat a little bread. Signy ate quickly, eyes still tracking seams as if she could chew and judge at the same time. Her helper tended the tar pot, keeping it warm. The smell rose in slow waves. It was heavy and earthy and oddly comforting, like the scent of a campfire after people had stopped talking. When the seams were packed, Signy lifted the ladder. "Now we seal." Bram leaned in, curious. Signy held the ladder over a seam and let tar drip into it. The tar was dark and glossy. It sank into the fibre and made it look like a line of night. Signy used the brush to spread tar along the seam edges and over the overlap where water would try to creep. Bram watched the tar darken the wood. It made the hull look older and more serious. It looked like the ship had stopped being a project and started being a tool. Ewan took another brush and worked on the next seam. He did not slather, he covered. He worked tar into the fibres and along the line. Enough to seal, enough to protect, not so much that it dripped like an overfed candle. Bram took a brush and tried. His first stroke was too thick. Tar oozed and sagged. Signy gave him a look. "That is not paint. You are not decorating." Bram wiped the excess with a rag, embarrassed. Ewan kept his voice calm. "Thin layers. The hull will get more tar later. Boats are maintained. They are not finished once and forgotten." Bram nodded. Maintenance sounded like the opposite of hero stories, and that felt accurate. As the afternoon moved on, the hull took on a subtle sheen. Tar caught the light in dull highlights. The smell settled into the yard. The bay breeze carried it outward. Late afternoon brought Jarl Rowan because of course it did. He arrived with his guards and scribe, stepping carefully around the work area as if a puddle of tar might jump at him. Rowan stopped a few paces from the hull and frowned. "It smells like smoke and trouble." "It smells like not sinking," Ewan replied. Rowan leaned closer. "What are you doing now?" Signy answered before Ewan needed to. "We are making the ship less inviting to water." Rowan looked at Signy as if he had expected her to be a rumour. "Signy Tarwell." Signy gave a small nod. "Jarl Rowan. Still alive. Good." Rowan did not know how to respond to that. He chose to ignore it. He looked at the seams, the tar lines, the darkened overlaps. Will it be watertight? Ewan met Rowan gaze. "It'll be a ship. Ships take in a little water, then the crew bails. That is normal. The goal is not to keep all water out forever. The goal is to keep enough out that you arrive dry enough to complain about the weather." Rowan grimaced. "I prefer not to bail." "Then do not go to sea," Ewan replied. Rowan stared, then exhaled. "Fine. How much bailing?" Ewan shrugged slightly. "Depends on the build, the sea, the weather, and whether your crew remembers they have hands." Rowan looked uneasy. "My rivals say their ships never take water." Signy laughed once, short and sharp. "Your rivals are lying, or they have not been anywhere interesting." Rowan glanced at her, offended and amused at the same time. "You speak boldly." Signy wiped tar from her fingers with a rag. "I speak accurately. Boldness is when you speak without knowing." Rowan turned back to Ewan. "And this tar, it lasts." "It lasts until it does not," Ewan replied. "Sun, salt, sand, and scraping on beaches will wear it." "You will wear tar." You will inspect seams, you will replace fibre where needed, you will care for the ship like you care for any valuable tool. Rowan frowned. So it is ongoing. Ewan nodded. The sea is ongoing. It would be strange if ships were not. Rowan looked at the hull again. The tar made it look strong. He seemed reassured by the appearance, which was understandable. Many people took comfort in what they could see. Water preferred what people could not see. Rowan spoke softly, almost to himself. Spring gathering is not far. Ewan kept working. It will be closer tomorrow. That is how time behaves. Rowan held his impatience like a heavy cloak. He looked at Bram. Apprentice, is the ship ready to carry barrels? Bram paused. He had learned not to answer quickly when a powerful man asked a simple question. Bram spoke carefully. It is becoming ready. It will be strong. We are making sure the seams are honest. Rowan studied him, then nodded. Good. Keep it honest. I do not want to arrive at Tunsberg with wet socks and a story. Ewan finally looked up. If you arrive with wet socks, it will be because you stepped in a pudder, not because I built poorly. Rowan almost smiled. That was as close as he came to trust. He left again, guards following, scribes scribbling as if tar could be translated into speed. The yard felt calmer after Rowan departed, even though the work remained. Sponsors had a way of changing the air simply by occupying it. As evening approached, the tar pot cooled. The last seams were brushed. Sini inspected the work with a critical eye that made Bram feel like a plank under scrutiny. She pressed along a seam line near midship. Good. She checked another. Good. She checked Bram's section near the bow. Her finger paused. Bram's heart tightened. Sini leaned in closer. She studied the line. Then she nodded. Good enough. You will do better next time, but good enough for now. Bram exhaled slowly. He did not know he had been holding his breath. That seemed to happen a lot in shipbuilding. Ewan covered the tar pot. He spoke quietly. Tomorrow we let it set. Then we continue inside work. Thwarts. Mast step soon. Signy glanced at him. Mast step soon means you will want more rope and more tar. Ewan nodded. We always want more rope and more tar. Signy gathered her tools. Her helper lifted the bundle. She looked at Bram and last time. Quiet, Dot. Remember this. Bram waited. Signy spoke with calm certainty. The sea does not enter like an enemy. It enters like a visitor who was never invited but acts like it belongs. Your job is to keep it outside without insulting it. Bram nodded. Keep it outside. Politely. Signy gave a short approving sound and left the yard. Her footsteps steady, her presence lingering in the scent of tar. Ewan and Bram stood beside the hull as the light faded. The tar on the seams looked almost black in the evening. The planks seemed to settle, content with their new protection. Bram spoke softly. It feels like we are sealing a secret. Ewan looked at the bay. We are sealing a habit, he replied. The habit of water to get in. The ship will still live. It will still breathe. It will still move. But it will do so on our terms, not the sea terms. Bram found the thought soothing. They cleaned brushes and rags because tar was patient and would wait overnight to ruin anything left unattended. They washed hands with sand and water, scrubbing until their skin smelled like smoke and pine and stubbornness. As they finished, the tide rose again. The waterline crept closer, quiet and inevitable. The bay reflected the sky. The gulls settled into sleepier arguments. Ewan looked at the hull one last time. The seams were packed. The tar had been laid. The ship smelled like readiness. Bram felt tired in the gentle way that made sleep inviting. Ewan spoke as they turned toward the shed. People think the sea respects courage. It respects preparation. Courage is what you pretend you have when you forgot to prepare. Bram nodded, mind calm. He liked that. It felt true. Outside, Alder Bay breathed with the tide. Inside the yard, the hull rested with its seams sealed and its future held together by iron and patience. The sea waited, polite and rude at the same time, and the ship waited too, quietly learning how to keep it outside. Chapter 8. Mast and Sail. The part where wind gets opinions too. The next morning was clear and cold. The tar had set into a dull sheen along the seams. The hull looked darker, more serious, as if it had aged overnight into a ship that expected responsibility. Bram walked around it slowly, hands behind his back the way Ewan often did. Bram hoped that copying the posture might also copy the calm. It helped a little. Ewan arrived carrying a length of rope and a small bundle of wooden fittings. He set them down and looked up at the open top of the hull. "Today," Ewan told Bram, "we invite the wind." Bram felt a small thrill. Wind felt like magic compared to seams and tar. Ewan stepped into the hull and pointed at the centre area where the mast step would sit. "Not exactly centre," he explained, "but placed for balance. The mast is not decoration, it is a lever. Put it wrong and the ship argues with itself." Bram climbed inside. The hull felt different now, more enclosed, more like a place that belonged to the living. Frames and thwarts made patterns of structure. The curved planks held the light in soft bands. Ewan set a heavy wooden block on the keel area, shaped to fit. "This is the mast step. It takes the base of the mast, it spreads the load into the keel and floors." Bram touched the block. It looked simple. It did not feel simple. "How do we make sure it holds?" Bram asked. "We fit it correctly," Ewan replied. "We brace it. We tie it into the structure. The mast pushes down and pulls sideways. The wind tries to fold things that were meant to stand. We do not allow it." Bram nodded. Not allowing the wind sounded ambitious. They began by fitting the mast step block. Ewan checked contact points against the keel and floor timbers. He shaved a little from one side. He tested again. He shaved again. He tested again. Bram recognized the rhythm. Trim, test. Trim, test. It was the shipyard heartbeat. When the block sat flush, Ewan began setting braces. Knees and supports tied the step into nearby frames. The goal was simple. The mast should not walk, it should not twist, it should not complain. Bram held a brace while Ewan drilled. The auger turned with a steady squeak. Bram watched the bit break through, then withdraw. Ewan inserted a fastening and set it firm. Ewan looked at Bram. "When the mast is up, you will want to blame the wind for everything. Remember this part. The wind will do what it does. Your job is to give it a place to push without breaking the ship." Bram nodded. Outside the hull, Tolan Ford arrived with his usual dislike of ceremony. He carried a small iron fitting and set it on the bench. "For the mast," he grunted. "Not everything should be wood." Ewan gave a small nod. "Good." Tolan looked at the sky. "Wind is up today." Bram glanced outward. A breeze moved across the bay. It was not strong, but it was steady, like it was practicing. Ewan finished the mast step area, then turned to the mast itself. The mast timber lay on supports nearby, already selected and trimmed. It was a long straight piece, lighter than the keel, but still strong enough to feel like it could cause trouble if it fell on you. Bram ran a hand along it. "It feels different from oak." "It is," Ewan replied. Good mast timber needs strength and flexibility. Often pine, sometimes spruce. It must be straight. It must not twist when it dries. It must hold the sail without acting like it wants to return to the forest. Bram pictured a mast trying to return to the forest, dragging sail and crew behind it. He decided he preferred cooperation. They shaped the mast with draw knife and plane, smoothing it and tapering it slightly toward the top. Bram worked carefully, watching Ewan hands. He learned to read the grain and avoid tearing fibers. He learned to take thinner shavings instead of forcing thick ones. Ewan checked the mast length against the hull. "Not too tall," he explained. "Too tall and it becomes a lever the sea uses against you. Too short and the sail cannot do enough work. Balance." Bram repeated the word in his mind. Balance. It was the word that kept appearing everywhere. By midday, Signe Tarwell returned, because rope was never far from her. She carried coils that smelled of hemp and salt and practical effort. She also carried a bundle of sailcloth samples, folded neatly. "Rowan asked me to make sure you are not pretending you can braid wind," Signe observed as she stepped into the yard. Ewan gave her a calm nod. "We are not braiding wind, we are giving wind a job." Signe dropped the rope coils with a soft thud. "These are good. strong, fancy. Fancy rope fails with style. This fails less. Bram picked up a coil. It felt rough. It felt alive. It felt like something that could burn your hands if you treated it carelessly. Signe pointed at the mast. You will want shrouds and stays. You will want halyards. You will want sheets. You will want lashings for blocks. You will want spares because the sea likes to test promises. Bram tried to keep track of all the words. Shrouds, stays, halyards, sheets. It sounded like a laundry list for a very ambitious laundry. Ewan began fitting the mast partner, the support at the level of the deck area that would hold the mast upright. It was a crosspiece with an opening shaped to cradle the mast. Bram asked, "Why does the mast need support up here if it sits in the step down there?" "Because the mast does not trust one friend," Ewan replied. "It wants two, one at the foot, one near the top of the hull, and then the rigging holds it in place like calm hands on a restless shoulder." Bram nodded. Calm hands. That sounded like something he could learn. They lifted the mast into the hull for a test fit. It took effort. Bram and Ewan and Tolan guided it upright. The mast rose slowly, the top passing above the hull line. Bram felt his chest tighten as it stood. It felt like a milestone. The ship now had a spine and ribs, and also a spine that reached up to meet the sky. Ewan checked the fit at the mast step and the mast partner. He adjusted the partner opening with careful shaves. He lowered the mast and raised it again until it sat upright without forcing. When the mast stood true, Ewan stepped back and looked up. The wind moved the mast slightly. It was subtle. It was enough to make Bram realize this was not a statue. It was a system. It was going to move. It was going to live. Signe watched with narrowed eyes. "Good, it sits," Tolan grunted, "until the first gust tries to prove a point." Ewan kept his voice calm. "That is why we rig." They began adding rigging points. Wooden blocks for lines, cleats, lashings, a place for the yard, the horizontal spar that would hold the square sail. Bram learned new kinds of knots, simple but vital. A knot that slipped was not a small problem. It was a future story. Signe demonstrated a knot once, then made Bram repeat it until his fingers could do it without thinking. She did not scold, she simply waited, which was worse in a way. Waiting made Bram responsible for his own improvement. By late afternoon they turned to the sailcloth. "The sail will be square," Ewan explained. "Not because we dislike triangles, but because this is what works with our rigs and our waters. It catches wind well on open reaches." The sail would be finished soon by weavers and stitchers. For now, they focused on the yard and lines that would raise it. Ewan fitted the yard to the mast with a simple system of halyards. Bram learned to run the line through a block and down to a cleat. He learned to keep line tension even. He learned that line management was mostly about preventing tangles, because tangles were the true enemy of calm. Then came the oars. Bram looked surprised. "Oars too?" Ewan nodded. "The wind is helpful when it feels like it. Oars are helpful when you insist. A good ship uses both." They checked the oar ports along the hull. They fitted simple covers that could reduce splashing. Bram imagined a crew rowing in steady rhythm, the ship sliding forward even when the sail hung slack. It felt reassuring. The ship did not depend on wet's mood. It had options. Late in the day, Rowan arrived again, because it was the season of Rowan arriving again. He stepped into the yard with his guards and scribe. He looked at the mast, then up at the sky, then back at the mast. His expression turned into something like respect. "So it reaches," Rowan observed. "It reaches," Ewan replied. Rowan walked closer and touched the mast lightly, as if expecting it to feel expensive. It felt like wood. Rowan seemed slightly disappointed by that, and then decided to be impressed anyway. "When will the sail be on?" Rowan asked. "Soon," Sina replied before Ewan needed to. "When cloth is stitched and edges are reinforced, you cannot hang a blanket and call it a sail." Rowan looked at Sini. "I did not ask you." Sini shrugged. "You needed an answer." Rowan blinked, then chose not to fight that particular battle. He turned to Ewan. "And this rig, it will make us fast." Ewan spoke calmly. "It will make you as fast as the wind allows and as fast as your crew can handle. Speed also depends on loading. If you fill the ship like a pantry, it will move like a pantry." Rowan frowned. I intend to bring many barrels. Then you intend to trade, Ewan replied. That is fine. Just do not expect the ship to float like a feather while carrying your entire pride. Rowan almost smiled. Almost. He looked up at the mast again. Will it hold in a storm? Ewan met Rowan's gaze. If a storm wants to break things, it will try. We build so it has to try hard. We rig so we can reduce sail quickly. We rely on skill and caution, not on luck. Rowan nodded, serious now. Good. I prefer caution. Luck makes me tired. Bram thought that was the first wise thing Rowan had said without being pushed. Rowan stepped back and watched Bram coiling a line neatly. Apprentice, you know what you are doing with those ropes, Bram answered carefully. I am learning to keep them from becoming a problem. Rowan nodded. That is most of leadership. Signy made a short, amused sound. Bram did not know whether to feel honoured or alarmed. Rowan left again, satisfied for the moment, scribe writing something that would later become a neat list that did not include how many times Rowan had worried out loud. As dusk approached, the wind eased. The mast stood quiet. The lines hung in gentle curves. The hull looked tall and strong, seams dark with tar, overlaps stitched with iron, frames steady inside. Ewan lowered the mast for the night, not all the way, but enough to reduce strain. He explained to Bram that leaving a mast upright without need was like leaving a door open in a storm. It invited trouble. Trouble needed no invitation. They secured everything. They checked knots, they checked cleats, they checked blocks, they covered sailcloth pieces and stored them dried. Bram felt the day settle into his bones. He had learned that wind was not a friend you could rely on, but it was also not an enemy. It was a force that needed clear rules. As the light faded, Bram stood near the bow and looked out at the bay. The water was smooth. The sky held a pale band near the horizon. The tide moved in slow silence. Ewan joined him. Tomorrow we will finish more interior work, he murmured, steering, more fittings, and soon we raise sail properly and see how the ship behaves. Bram nodded. I want to see it move. Ewan gave him a brief look. Wanting is fine. Just remember that the first time a ship moves, it is not a parade, it is a conversation. The ship speaks through creaks and pull and balance. We listen. Bram felt calm, listening again, always listening. The yard grew quiet. The tools slept on benches. The ropes lay coiled like resting snakes that had decided not to be dramatic. The tar smell lingered in the air. The mast rested. The hull waited. Outside, Alder Bay breathed with the tide. Wind moved across the water in small ripples, practicing. The ship stood ready to meet it, not with bravado, but with careful craft and the quiet confidence of things built correctly. Chapter 9. Launch Day at Tunsberg Harbour. The ship did not look nervous. Bram did. The morning they prepared to move the hull, Alder Bay felt too quiet, like the bay was holding its breath to see whether the work would embarrass itself. The sky was pale. The water was calm. The wind moved just enough to remind everyone that it existed. Ewan walked the length of the ship in silence, hands behind his back, eyes taking inventory. He checked the seams where tar lay dark and steady. He checked the rivet lines, small heads neat along each overlap. He checked the mast fittings and the coils of rope stored dry. He checked the steering oar, the long blade that would act like a firm hand on the ship's shoulder. Bram followed a pace behind, trying to look calm. His hands kept finding nothing to do, which made them restless. He had spent weeks being useful. Now the work was about to move, and movement felt like a new kind of risk. Signy Tarwell arrived early, because rope people enjoyed being present when rope mattered. She brought extra line, spare lashings, and a look that suggested he had already forgiven them for any mistakes they had not made yet. Toland Ford arrived as well, carrying a small bundle of iron fittings and a hammer that looked like it had learned patience through sheer exhaustion. He inspected the rivets one last time, then made a satisfied grunt that sounded like approval for a world that rarely deserved it. Jarl Rowan arrived with the usual arrangement of guards and scribe. He looked less like a man visiting a shipyard and more like a man attending a performance. His cloak was clean. His boots were cleaner than they should have been, which was his way of announcing that he did not intend to slip in public. Rowan stopped near the bow and stared at the hull. "It is larger than I imagined," he observed. Ewan gave him a calm look. "It is the size we agreed to build." Rowan circled slowly. He ran a hand along the overlap line and felt the rivet heads like a man counting reasons to trust. He looked at Bram, then at Ewan, then at the ship again. "It seems solid." "It is solid enough to float," Ewan replied. "Also solid enough to punish foolish loading. Try not to insult it." Rowan frowned. "Insult it." "If you stack barrels like you hate balance," Ewan replied, "the ship will respond with a lesson." Rowan exhaled slowly. "Fine. I will stack barrels with respect." Singmi bait a short, amused sound. Respect is free. It is also often ignored. Rowan chose not to argue with her. Instead, he turned his attention to the larger problem. "How do we get it to Tunsberg harbour?" Ewan looked at the slipway. "The sea will do most of it. First we put it in the water, then we move along the coast. Calm weather is a gift. We accept gifts when they appear." Rowan looked out at the bay as if trying to decide whether it looked generous. The bay stayed calm, which was as close to generosity as it offered. The moving began with simple things. Greased rails, rounded logs, ropes set in place, hands positioned where hands would not be crushed. Bram helped smear grease along the slipway rails. It was a messy job. It was also satisfying. Grease was the quiet friend of heavy objects. Bram liked friends like that. Men from Rowan household arrived to help. They stood around at first, uncertain whether to speak. Ewan did not invite speaking. He began placing rollers under the hull supports and pointed at tasks as if assigning them to the air. People took the hints and became useful. Ewan spoke with calm authority. "You there, hold that line. You, lift that wedge. You, do not stand where the ship can turn you into a memory." The men shifted quickly away from the danger zone. Rowan watched, arms folded. He looked as if he wanted to be in charge and also wanted not to be responsible for anything that could go wrong. This was a common sponsor condition. Bram took a line and felt the weight through it even before anything moved. The ship was heavy. The ship was also stubborn, as if it did not fully trust the idea of leaving the place where it had been built. Ewan placed his hand on the hull near the midship area. He spoke softly, not for ritual, but because speaking softly made the moment feel controlled. "Now," he murmured, "we go." The first pull did almost nothing. The second pull made a sound. The hull shifted a finger width. The rollers creaked. The ropes tightened. The ship moved, reluctant but willing, like a large animal that had decided to cooperate as long as nobody got excited about it. Bram pulled with the others. His shoulders burned. His breath came out in slow puffs. He felt the hull movement through the line like a living thing. Rowan stood close enough to see it move. His expression changed. He looked briefly like a child watching a door open on its own. The hull slid another short distance. Ewan called for the rollers to be moved forward. Men ran to reposition them, careful and focused. The shipyard was suddenly full of quiet urgency, the kind that does not yell because yelling does not reduce weight. Signy stood near the stern with an extra coil of rope. She watched the lines like a hawk watches mice. Her eyes flicked to Bram when his grip shifted. Her gaze was enough to correct him. Bram adjusted his hands, steadier now. He did not want Signy disappointed sound aimed at him. He had learned that a disappointment was both accurate and exhausting. Toland stayed near the side, watching the hull supports and listening for any sound that suggested a strain. He did not speak much. When he did speak, people moved quickly. "That wedge is slipping," he warned at one point. Ewan moved in and tapped it back, then replaced it with a better tone. "Better. Continue." The hull slid down the slipway in slow, controlled steps. Roller, pull, pause. Roller, pull, pause. Each pause felt like the ship considering whether the sea deserved it. As the hull neared the waterline, Bram felt the air change. The sea smell grew stronger. The dampness rose. The bay felt closer, like it was leaning in. Rowan stepped forward, then stopped himself. He looked as if he wanted to push and also feared becoming the man who pushed a ship wrong in front of witnesses. Ewan glanced at him. If you want to help, hold this line. Do not pull, just hold. If it runs, you stop it. If you do not stop it, it stops itself, and not kindly. Rowan took the line. His hands looked unfamiliar on rope. He held it anyway, jaw set as if determination could substitute for practice. Good, Senior observed, sounding surprised. The Jarl is learning. Rowan did not respond. He was busy being serious. The hull reached the last stretch of rails. The water touched the lower planks, then withdrew with the tide motion. It touched again, a little higher. The sea was testing the hull like a polite inspector. Euron called for a final slow pull. The hull moved, and then it floated. Not dramatically, not with a splash. It simply shifted its relationship with the world. The weight lifted off the rails. The ship settled into the water like a long exhale. Bram felt his throat tighten. He had expected joy to be loud. It was quiet instead. It was a calm satisfaction, like watching something heavy finally rest where it belonged. Rowan stared. It floats, he murmured, sounding as if he had not been fully sure. It floats, Euron replied. That was the plan. Scene made a short approving sound. It floats because you did not lie to the seams. Tolan watched the waterline. No sudden seep, no ugly list. The hull sat level. He grunted. Good enough. Bram stood on the shore, wet to the knees from helping guide the stern line. He watched the ship bob slightly. The overlap lines caught the light. The tar seams looked dark and confident. The mast fittings waited like a promise. Now, Ewan said, we listen. They brought the ship alongside the shallow edge and stepped in carefully. The first time Bram put his weight into the hull, he expected a wobble that would unalive his dignity. The ship shifted, then steadied. The hull flexed slightly, not weak but alive. Ewan stood near midship and felt the balance. He placed a foot here, then there, adjusting his stance like a man who had done this often. He nodded, satisfied. Rowan climbed in next, clumsy but determined. He tried to step like a Jarl. The ship did not care. It rocked. Rowan stiffened. His guards looked alarmed, as if the sea had attacked him personally. Ewan spoke calmly. Bend your knees. The ship moves. You move with it. If you freeze, you fall. Rowan bent his knees reluctantly. The ship steadied. Rowan looked offended that balance required humility. Bram tried to hide his amusement. He did not fully succeed. Rowan glanced at him. Do not enjoy this. Bram kept his voice careful. I am not enjoying, I am learning. Signy smirked slightly. Learning can look like enjoyment, it is rare. They set the steering oar and checked its fits. The oar rested on a side mount and could be swung with controlled pressure. Euron tested it with a slow movement. The ship responded by turning slightly, obedient. Good, Euron murmured. Steering feels honest. Tolan checked the iron fittings near the steering mount. No strain yet. He nodded once. They set a few oars and tested rowing in the calm bay. Bram took an oar position and felt the blade bite water. Pull, release, pull, release. The ship moved forward with a gentle glide that made Bram want to smile too much. Rowan sat on a thwart and watched, trying to look as if he had always intended for the ship to glide exactly like that. His scribe tried to write while on a moving hull and immediately looked betrayed by reality. Rowan spoke to the scribe. Stop writing and hold on. The scribe chose survival. The wax tablet went away. They practiced turning. Ewan gave small instructions. Rowing is not strength, he reminded them. It is timing. Strength helps. Timing keeps you from fighting each other. Bram listened and adjusted his strokes. The oars began to move in smoother rhythm. The ship responded with steadier motion. Then the wind shifted. It was not dramatic at first. A breeze came off the wider sea, slipping into the bay mouth like a visitor testing the mood. The water surface changed, small ripples sliding under the hull. The ship moved a little differently. Ewan looked up. There it is. The wind wants to give opinions. Rowan straightened. Is it safe? Safe is not a word the sea understands, Ewan replied. We can be careful. That is what we can do. Signy nodded. "Raise only a little at first. Let it speak before you give it full voice." They prepared the sail. The cloth had been finished and brought from the weavers. It was folded carefully, reinforced at edges with loops and lash points ready. Bram touched it and felt its weight. It was not a delicate blanket. It was a tool meant to catch force. They attached the sail to the yard and prepared the halyard. Bram helped run lines and check knots. Signy inspected each knot with a finger and a look. If the knot displeased her, she made Bram redo it without a lecture. The redo was the lecture. Rowan watched the preparation. His impatience returned, trying to squeeze into the moment. "Hurry," he urged. Ewan kept his tone calm. "The wind will still be there in a minute. It enjoys waiting." Rowan held his tongue, which for him was impressive. They raised the yard a little. The sail lifted and caught a small breath of wind. It filled slightly, then fluttered. The ship responded by nudging forward, the hull whispering along the water. Bram felt a rush of quiet awe. It worked. The wind touched cloth and became motion. It was almost too simple to believe. Ewan adjusted the sheet line. The sail shape changed. The flutter eased. The pull became steadier. The ship began moving out of the bay toward the coastal route. Rowan looked pleased, then quickly looked serious again, because pleased sponsors often feared being punished for enjoying themselves. The coastline slid by, low rocks, sandy patches, dark pines. The sea opened wider. The wind grew steadier. The ship rode small waves with a gentle lift and settle, like breathing. Bram watched the planks flex in tiny ways. He felt the ship respond to each wave without complaining sharply. The overlaps held. The rivets held. The seams stayed quiet. The tar did its job. Ewan held the steering oar and guided their line along the coast. His face remained calm, but his attention was everywhere. He watched the sail. He watched the water. He watched the hull movement. He listened to creaks and shifts like someone listening to a familiar voice. Rowan sat amidships, hands on his knees. His guards looked uneasy. They were used to land where danger could be pointed at. At sea, danger hid in water and wind, and the idea that you were standing on a moving object that did not care about your status. The scribe, brave or foolish, tried to write again. The boat rocked slightly. The scribe stopped. Wisdom arrived. Singh sat near the lines, alert and calm. She corrected a coil that began to tangle. She checked a cleat. She watched the sail and nodded faintly at its behavior. Then, as if the sea wanted to test their pride, a slightly larger wave rolled under the bow. The ship lifted, then set down with a firmer thump. A small spray of water came over the side, splashing into the hull. Rowan jerked. He looked offended. Water. Ewan stayed calm. "That is normal." Rowan looked at his boots. "They are wet." "Yes," Ewan replied. "You are on the sea." Rowan turned to Bram. "Is this what you meant by bailing?" Bram glanced at the small puddle and answered carefully. "This is what Ewan meant by not pretending. We bail when it gathers." Signy handed Rowan a small bailer. "Here, do something useful. It will help your mood." Rowan took it reluctantly. He scooped once and dumped the water back into the sea with a stiff motion that suggested he was returning an insult. Bram almost smiled. He kept it small. They continued along the coast for hours, moving steadily toward Tunsberg harbour. The wind helped, then eased, then helped again. When it eased too much, they took oars and kept moving. The combination felt practical and calm. The ship did not argue. It worked. As afternoon approached, the harbour came into view. Tunsberg lay ahead, a busy line of masts and hulls, voices carrying over water. Boats moved in and out. People gathered on docks and along the shoreline. It was the kind of place where every arrival was a message. Rowan straightened as they approached. He adjusted his cloak. He looked at the sail, then at the harbour, then at the people turning to watch. His expression turned into the careful pride of a man trying to look casual while achieving something. Ewan guided the ship in with controlled ease. He reduced sail. He used the steering oar and a few oar strokes to align their approach. The hull glided between other vessels like it belonged there. People on the docks watched. Some nodded, some whispered. Some tried to pretend they were not impressed. Those were the ones who were most impressed. Bram felt heat in his chest. He wanted to look at everyone and announce, "I helped." He did not. He had learned that real work did not need announcing. They brought the ship alongside and secured lines. Signey tied knots with quick certainty. The ship settled against the dock, wood against wood, a quiet new presence among familiar shapes. Rowan stepped onto the dock. He turned back to look at the ship. For a moment, he looked genuinely satisfied, not because people watched him, but because the ship existed and floated and moved the way it was meant to. He looked at Ewan. It made it here. Ewan gave him a calm look. That was also the plan. Rowan nodded. "My rivals will notice." "They will," Ewan replied. "Then they will pretend they do not." Rowan almost smiled. Almost. Bram stayed on the ship a moment longer, hand resting on the rail. He listened to the harbour sounds and felt the hull beneath his feet, steady and alive. He thought of the forest, the cleaving, the shaping, the rivets, the tar, the knots, the quiet corrections. All of it had become that. A ship at water, a ship in a harbour, a ship ready to carry goods and people and pride without needing to shout. Ewan stepped beside Bram. "You did well," he murmured, as if saying it louder might unalive the calm. Bram felt a warm surge. He kept his voice soft. "Thank you." Ewan nodded once. "Tomorrow you will learn the next part." Bram looked confused. "Next part?" Ewan glanced at the hull as if it were a student. "Keeping it alive. Boats do not end at launch, they begin." Bram nodded slowly. He understood. He also felt oddly comforted. The story did not end. It simply continued, like the tide. The sun lowered over Tunsberg harbour. The wind softened. The ship rested against the dock, dark seams, neat rivets, steady lines. It looked calm, like it had always belonged on the sea. Bram felt his tiredness settle into the gentle kind that invited sleep. He watched the harbour lights appear and listened to the water lapping softly against the hull. The sea did not applaud. It lecho would be the reale details out, remade against a värming quality. Nothing such of plusen more erostad death. Chapter 10. The craft outlives the deadline. The morning after arrival, Tunsberg harbour looked different. Not because the harbour had changed, but because Bram had. He woke early on the ship, wrapped in a simple blanket near the midship area. The hull creaked softly. The water made small sounds against the planks. Rope lines hummed faintly with the harbour breeze. Everything sounded alive in a calm way, like a sleeping animal shifting in its rest. Bram sat up slowly and looked around. The ship interior was dim in early light. The frames curved along the sides like ribs. The thwarts ran across, simple and strong. The mast rose above, held by fittings and lines that looked like quiet decisions. The smell of tar and wood and salt filled the air. He remembered when this space had been empty. He remembered when it had been only an idea on a board and a finger drawing in sands. Now it was a place, and Bram had slept in it. That felt significant in a way he could not fully explain. Ewan was already awake. He sat near the stern, checking a line and listening to the hull as if it were telling him something private. "You slept," Ewan observed. Bram nodded. "I slept." "Good," Ewan replied. "Boats teach you to sleep when you can. The sea does not schedule rest for you." Bram rubbed his eyes. "It is strange. I can hear it all." Ewan nodded. "You can. The ship talks. The hull flexes. The lines shift. The water taps. It is not a warning. It is a conversation. People who fear every creak do not last long at sea." Bram listened again. The creaks sounded like wooden sighs, not alarms. He felt his mind settle. They began the morning with a quiet inspection. Ewan checked seams inside. He checked the rivet lines for any weeping. He checked where frames met shell for any gaps caused by settling. He checked the steering oar mount. He checked the mast step and partner. Bram followed and learned how to look. Not with panic, with attention. At one seam near the bow, a thin, damp line showed where water had found a tiny path. Not much, not dangerous, but real. Bram pointed. There. Ewan leaned in. He pressed a finger to the seam. A small weep. Normal. We correct it. Bram felt a small relief. The ship was not failing. It was living. Ewan took a bit of fibre and a small iron. He tapped gently. Tap. Press. Tap. Press. He added a touch of tar. The line disappeared. Now, Ewan murmured, it will weep somewhere else eventually. Then we correct that. This is not a battle you win once. It is a relationship you maintain. Bram nodded. Maintenance again. The unglamorous truth. Signy arrived later in the morning because rope people always returned when they were needed. She carried a small bundle of spare line and a cloth bag with fibre. You found a weep, she observed, eyes scanning the hull like she could smell the damp. Ewan nodded. Small. Signy looked satisfied. Small is fine. Small means you did the work correctly. Big means you lied to yourself. Bram kept that in mind. Lie and the sea finds it. Rowan arrived just before midday. He looked rested. He also looked like a man who had slept poorly anyway, because anxiety was one of his favourite hobbies. He stood on the dock beside the ship and watched Ewan work. He looked at the seams, he looked at the rig, he looked at the steering oar. He looked at the hull lines as if trying to memorize the shape, so he could later claim he had always understood it. Ewan stepped out onto the dock and wiped his hands. Rowan nodded toward the ship. It drew eyes yesterday. Yes, Ewan replied. Rowan held his chin higher. My rivals asked question. Of course, Ewan replied. Questions are cheaper than skill. Rowan almost smiled. Almost. He looked at Bram. Apprentice, you handled yourself well. Bram felt his face warm. He answered softly. I tried. Rowan nodded. Trying worked. Signy made a short, amused sound. That is the first wise thing you have said all week, Rowan blinked. Then he decided to accept it as praise, because fighting with Signy did not improve a day. Rowan turned to Ewan. I want to know what I must do to keep it like this. Strong, straight, impressive. Ewan looked at him calmly. First, stop thinking of it as impressive. Think of it as a tool. Tools last when you respect them. Rowan frowned slightly. Ewan continued. You keep seams sealed, you inspect overlaps, you retar when the sun and salt strip it, you keep lines dry when possible, you repair cloth when it frays, you keep the ship from sitting too long in shallow mud where it can be dragged and scraped. You do not overload it, you do not ram it into rocks because you are watching someone smile at you on a dock. Rowan looked offended. I would not ram it. Ewan kept his voice steady. Many people do not plan to ram. They simply assume the sea will adjust itself for their pride. Rowan exhaled. Fine. I will avoid pride ramming. Signy nodded. Good. Pride is heavy. Rowan glanced at her. Everything you say sounds like a warning. Because warnings keep people alive, Signy replied. Rowan looked as if he wanted to argue, then decided to be practical again. And the crew. How do I choose a crew? Ewan answered without hurry. Choose people who listen. Choose people who can row in rhythm without trying to be the hero. Choose someone to watch the seams and bail without complaining. Choose someone to manage lines without turning them into knots that hate you. Choose someone who can steer calmly and not chase every wave. Rowan looked at Bram. Like him. Bram froze. Ewan spoke gently. Bram is learning. He will be good if he keeps learning. Rowan nodded slowly. Then I will need more like him. Signy made a short sound. More quiet apprentices. The world is healing. Rowan looked puzzled by that, which was normal. After Rowan left, the harbour day continued. People came to look at the ship. Some were curious, some were calculating, some were polite, some were not. Bram learned to watch how people looked at a hull. Builders looked at seams, traders looked at capacity. Rival Jarls looked at how many witnesses were watching. Gareth Stone appeared in the afternoon, because rival builders had trouble staying away from other people's success. He walked along the dock and stopped a few paces from the ship, face arranged into casual interest. So, Gareth observed, it floats. Ewan stood beside the rail calm. It does. Gareth ran his eyes along the overlap lines. Clean work. Fastenings look neat. Tolan, sitting on a coil of rope nearby, gave a short grunt. Neat because they are correct. Gareth looked at Tolan and decided not to poke that hornet nest. Gareth turned to Ewan. Rowan will brag. Rowan will worry, Ewan corrected. Worry is his favourite brag. Gareth let out a reluctant laugh. You always speak like the sea is listening. The sea is listening, Ewan replied. It hears your envy too. Try not to feed it. Gareth gave a small shake of his head. Fine. Enjoy your work. Ewan kept his gaze calm. We do. Gareth left, cloak shifting, pride intact enough for him to walk away without tripping. Bram watched him go. He expected to feel satisfaction. Instead, he felt something quieter. The rival did not matter. The ship mattered. The craft mattered. The small choices mattered. That evening, Ewan and Bram took the ship out again in calmer water beyond the busiest harbour lanes. They raised a portion of sail and practiced handling. They practiced turning into wind. They practiced easing sheets. They practiced lowering quickly. They practiced rowing when the wind softened, because wind liked to disappear the moment you decided to trust it. Bram learned that a sail was not a simple wing. It was a living shape. It had moods. It demanded attention. When it flapped, it was not just noise, it was waste. When it pulled steadily, it was not just speed, it was balance. Ewan kept the steering oar steady. He gave Bram small tasks. Adjust this line, coil that rope, watch that seam, listen to the sound of the hull. Bram did each task slowly, calmly, with the quiet seriousness that made the work feel like a kind of meditation. When they returned to the dock under twilight, Bram felt tired in a good way. The ship settled and creaked softly. The water made its small taps. The harbour smelled of smoke and fish and wet wood. The sky darkened into a calm band over the sea. Bram sat on the dock edge and let his feet dangle above water. Ewan sat nearby, hands resting on his knees, gaze on the hull. Bram spoke softly. So this is it. We built it. We delivered it. Deadline met. Ewan nodded. Deadline met. But this is not the end. Bram looked at him. Ewan took his time. People think ships are made for one journey. They are made for many. The work continues every season. Retar, re-rope, re-stitch sail, refit a plank, fix a rivet that loosens, replace a worn block. Every year the ship teaches you again. If you listen, it stays with you. If you ignore it, the sea takes it. Bram listened, calm. So the craft outlives the deadline. Ewan nodded. The deadline was Rowan's problem. The craft is ours. Bram felt a warm steadiness inside him. He thought of the forest again, the oak stand, Halden tapping trunks and saying no, 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 then yes. He thought of cleaving logs and seeing clean grain. He thought of fitting planks and learning to touch seams with honest fingers. He thought of iron rivets, the sound of peening, the way small taps could hold a hull together. He thought of tar, dark and warm, sealing fibre and discouraging water. All of it felt like a thread, a long thread running through time. Ewan spoke again, voice quiet and even. People have built ships like this for generations, not because it is fashionable, because it works. Overlapping planks, a shell that flexes, rivets that lock, a sail that catches what it can, oars that insist when the wind refuses. It is simple, and it is not simple at all. Bram nodded. He understood. He did not need it simplified. Ewan continued. Someday the ship will be old, planks will be replaced, rivets renewed, tar laid again and again. Someone will look at it and think it is a relic, but it will have been a living thing, cared for by hands that learned patience. That is what matters. Bram stared at the waterline where the hull met the harbour. The ship moved slightly with the tide, not much, enough to remind him it was never truly still. Rowan approached quietly, which was unusual enough to be alarming. He stood behind them on the dock. Ewan looked up. Jarl Rowan. Rowan nodded. I wanted to say something. Signy, passing nearby with a coil of rope, slowed slightly. She looked curious. That was rare. Rowan cleared his throat. The ship is good. It carries my goods, and also my reputation, and it does not make me look foolish. I appreciate that. Ewan gave a small nod. That is the goal. Rowan looked at Bram. Apprentice. You worked hard. Bram spoke softly. Thank you. Rowan looked back at Ewan. I will pay what we agreed, and more for the extra iron and tar. I do not want to be the man who underpays the people who keep him dry. Sidney gave a short approving sound. That is almost wisdom. Rowan accepted that as the highest praise he was likely to receive. He nodded once more and walked away, cloak moving in the harbour breeze, boots still too clean but his posture lighter. Bram watched him go. He asked Ewan softly, Did he just thank us? Ewan nodded, quietly. Do not start him by mentioning it. Bram gave a small laugh. He kept it gentle. Night settled over Tunsberg harbour. Lanterns flickered. Voices softened. The water turned dark and smooth. The ship rested, seams sealed, lines coiled, mast quiet, hull steady. Bram lay down inside the ship again, blanket over him, the curved planks around him like a shelter. The hull creaked softly. The water tapped. The rope hummed faintly. It was all steady, all rhythmic, all calm. His mind drifted through the build again, not as a rush of scenes, but as a slow sequence of quiet lessons. Listen. Do not rush. Trim. Test. Correct. Maintain. Respect the sea. Respect the wood. Respect the small things. Somewhere beyond the harbour, the open sea waited. It always did. It would test the ship in its own patient way. It would not care about pride or rivalries or spring gatherings. It would care only about whether the craft had been honest. Bram felt no fear in that. He felt comfort. Honesty was something you could work toward. Honesty was something you could keep. Eurant's voice came softly from the stern area, where he still sat listening to the hull. Sleep, Bram. Tomorrow we go back to Alder Bay. The yard will look empty without the ship. Then we will build another, because that is what hands do. They build, they repair, they pass the craft forward. Bram closed his eyes. The harbour sounds faded. The hull sounds remained, gentle and steady. The craft outlived the deadline. The ship outlived the day. The sea outlived all of them, patient and listening, and for now it allowed the ship to rest.